get it? Did you get it? No? It's still hanging out of your mouth? Still hanging out of your mouth, kiddo? You gonna come with me? Are you gonna be in the pictures and stuff too?
Just let me know if you can hear me. I'll try to keep up with y'all's comments and stuff and answer questions. What's up, Raymond? Sorry for the delay. My 5-year-old is in the process of losing a second tooth on her bottom, and she lost one earlier this week, and she is not having it today. All right, how's the sound? I turned off the sound so I don't hear the echo of myself. Make sure you guys can actually hear okay. The neighbors behind me started going like literally at 4 o'clock on the dot, so it's perfect. Perfect time. What echo are you hearing? Is it me echoing? I'll just turn it up quite a bit, and you guys can just turn the volume down. Yes, that's not my drinking my imposter white claw. You gonna say hi, Cora? You want to come say hi? Sleepy's watching. She's not having that sleep. His feelings are going to be hurt if he didn't want to say hello. I hope everybody has an alcoholic beverage, adult beverage, or something to make this more entertaining for you all. You can say hi, look, come on. You can see you on. You're right there. You don't want to? Kendall's watching too. You say hi to Kendall? You wave with the camera? Right there, that one. Okay, you don't have to. Alright, sweet. I'll give everybody about 5 more minutes and then we'll start.
Why am I not seeing them?
You can't see them, but they're right here in the chat room. See? That's what's happening right now. See? You look at the camera, wave. There you go. Sweet. Yes. Maybe that snack will make your tooth come out. So I have a couple different setups here just while we're waiting for people. I took some notes, tried to make it a little bit professional, even though it's a little casual thing here. That's all. Alright, there's no sound coming out of anything. Alright, cool. So the sound's back on. I unplugged everything audio-wise. It should be pretty quiet now. There's no sound coming out of the computer. There's no sound coming out of any of my devices. So you shouldn't hear any echo anymore. You might hear a little bit of the lawnmower in the background. Hopefully it won't last forever. I'm going to bounce around. Make sure I got links everywhere. Alright, so I have a 3-camera setup here.
I'm just kind of show you guys how I can bump around. Yeah, you can have an apple. I apologize. I want to have her asking me questions. Kids are at home. I have a camera here so I can show you. This is just an A6000. This is a a Sony camera. It's a very, very popular, been around for a few years. Entry level, I won't say entry level, but like a lower end mirrorless camera that Sony has. Let's see, hold on, let me make sure. Let's just turn all these there. All right, sweet. You guys can let me know if the echo goes away. But yeah, so it has a camera here. I'll use this to kind of show you guys what I'm messing with. And then the other cool thing with this system is, this is called a Sling Studio, is I can actually show you what I'm looking at with the camera. So as we start jumping around and I start messing with things, you guys can actually see what I see. And it's, you know, very, very, you know, yeah, I think that was what it was. I think it was just the actual, it was taking sound from also the more than one source instead of just a microphone that I'm wearing. So cool. So I think we're good. Picture quality good for everybody. You want to see yourself up there again?
What?
Right there. So anyway, so I'll try to touch on a few of the biggest things. A lot of people ask me for advice on like what type of camera to shoot with, you know, how to shoot, basically like, you know, what aperture is, what shutter is. It's a very, very simple, machine, a camera. It literally is the matter of letting light in for a duration of time and through an aperture, which is how wide the lens opens up and closes. So it's like if you compare it to, you know, everyone's crowded outside on Black Friday to go, you know, get some deals. And you open the door, you know, 2 people wide, it's going to take a lot longer for that crowd of people to make it into the store. If you open the door or you take a whole wall out of the side of the building, the flow of individuals coming in the building is going to be a lot quicker, and so it won't take as long. So that's kind of how the balance of aperture and the balance of shutter basically work together. So if you have the aperture wide open, it doesn't take as long for the light spilling through the lens to hit the sensor on the camera to make an image. And inversely, if you have a very small aperture, it's going to take a lot longer for that light to pass through over a duration to expose an image on the sensor. So that's basically the function of a camera. It opens up an aperture on a lens that lets light hit a sensor, and when the light hits that sensor, maybe there's not enough light hitting the sensor, maybe there's too much light hitting the sensor. How bright or how dark the image is basically up to the photographer. You can take a photo that has a very small aperture and a very short duration on the shutter speed, and it doesn't make for an exposed image. It'll be dark, it'll be black. Or you could have it to where, you know, the aperture is, you know, fairly open, like a f1.4, which is pretty common for like the widest aperture for most professional lenses. And you can have the duration of the shutter for too long, and the image just comes out white because it's just, there's too much light. It overexposes the image. So it's just a matter of balancing that. And then when you have the aperture and the shutter at the right you know, combination is when you get an image that's perfectly exposed. So like if I was to go to my camera right now and I was to increase the aperture, which right now it's like f2, if I was to open the aperture even more, the image would get brighter. Or if I was to change the shutter speed to a slower shutter speed, it would get brighter. So there's different ways to skin a cat if you want to make a brighter image or a darker image. So that's really the big things, the 2 big things. So every single thing you see on a camera, all the different buttons, the menu button, the exposure button, all these little things are all just kind of features that make your camera more usable. It doesn't necessarily do anything for the function of the aperture or the shutter speed. Those things are kind of statistics that are set based off what camera model you buy. This camera is like a $400 to $600 camera. It's a very, very popular camera. Almost every time someone asks me what kind of camera they want or what I would recommend people buying, it's usually some version of a Sony camera. I mean, I actually shoot with Sony, so obviously I'm a little biased, but the reason why I shoot with Sony and the reason why I recommend Sony cameras is because they were kind of the leading mirrorless camera, and the benefit, the advantage to a mirrorless camera is you see exactly what you get before you take the picture. So if your image is too bright or your image is too dark, for example, we'll use this wonderful White Claw variable here, and I'll try to hold it steady. If I wanted to, I'm just in manual mode, so I'm not going to get into the details just yet about manual versus aperture priority, shutter priority, and all those things. But if I was to go and adjust one of my settings, that's the picture that I'm going to get right now. If I take this picture, it's overexposed, is all you can see. And then I say, okay, cool, let's go look at that photograph. And that photograph is exactly what I saw when I took the picture. So that's one advantage to the camera. There's a little bit of a delay, so I apologize. I'm trying to, like, even the delay that I have on my system here is about a second or two. So if I was to take the same exact photograph and try to, I'm gonna probably have to, I'm at max shutter speed at 4,000 right now. So if I was to, have the smallest aperture like a pinhole and have a very fast duration of my shutter speed, those two combinations together, they're not making for a very bright image. So if I take this picture right now, it's going to be literally the exact same thing that I just took. I don't have to guess. So with older SLRs, you would take a photograph, or a disposable camera, you take a photograph, a week later you finally develop and you realize, man, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. Every single photo was too bright or too dark or out of focus. So this is one of the main reason why I recommend Sony cameras, is because, or a mirrorless camera in general, is because you basically get to see what you're going to take a photo of. If the photograph's out of focus, if you for some reason were bit off on the wrong thing, you know right now that the can right now is not in focus. It is out of focus. So you can say, what am I doing? My focus is wrong, or my focus isn't focusing what I want. You kind of can see the problem before you waste the time taking the picture. So there's some advantages and disadvantages to some of the mirrorless cameras, but the further the technology goes, the smaller that gap is. So some of the things people complain about with mirrorless cameras is they don't typically have as fast a focus, but I do wedding photography, and I'm not doing super high-end sports, but some of the higher-end sports photographers are using Sony cameras and mirrorless cameras now, and they're having very little complaints. The gap is getting smaller and smaller. So that's basically why I use the Sony cameras. So that's why I'm using this camera today. I'm not using my camera that I'm filming me and Cora eat this apple here with. The camera that I use there is still like kind of outdated now. An A7R2 was like a $3,200 camera a few years ago. Now they have an A7R4, and I feel like I need to get a new camera, but I don't really have a huge need to upgrade right now. So the things I said for people to make sure they have, I think it was a good time to start talking about specifics, is have yourself an adult beverage. If you are using your computer or you're using the YouTube app, you can actually leave comments. As you can probably see, some people are. I don't even think you'll see the comments on your phone if you don't have the app. But if you have the app or you use a computer, it'll show you the comments. So if you guys have questions, I'll try to address them if they're pertinent to what we're talking about at the moment. If not, just write them down, and then once I get to the end of like an area, I'll try to answer questions as best I can. What's up, Angel? You want to show them your tooth? No, you want to show them your tooth? It's like hanging on by like a bare little tendon there, a nerve. No, I'm not shooting in 4K. I am shooting in 1080 because that is a limitation of the Sling Studio. Is it's a multiple streaming device. So the cool thing about, just so I can show you, there's a setup here. I definitely have a setup going on here, right? So I have the Sling Studio, which is what this is. It's basically a mobile hub. What it does is it puts, it's hard to see here. I can actually show my screen if I had another cable. It's probably not going to let you guys see it. But I have basically I have a bunch of different screens here that I can, I'm going to turn that off. Don't want that. You're the boss now? All right. So basically, let's see, go back to where we were. So basically let's get this down. I'm using this camera. It's a Sling. It's basically a Sling Studio. It's a mobile hub. You basically can use your cell phones or iPads or anything with a device on it. Or a camera on it. You can use most of those items as a camera, and you can stream. Have 4 different video feeds at one time, and you can swap between which video feeds you want to use. So like right now, I'm using my cell phone. It's just tethered right here for like an overhead camera shot, so you can actually see. The camera as I mess with the functions and the buttons on it. And then I have my professional camera that I'm using. Hey Angie. I have my professional camera that I'm using to film me, and then I have this A6000. It's also putting its video feed through the system, and I can just literally click and drag whatever video feed I want, and like right now it'll pop to myself. I can go to the camera that I'm showing you guys the photos off of, and then obviously the camera itself. So I could have a 4th device. A lot of the time the 4th device we'll use will be like a computer screen. So I can have an HDMI video input, and I could show you guys what I'm looking at on my screen as I'm editing or something like that. So, so cool. So the adult beverage is a necessary item. We're just hanging out in the backyard. Adeline's going to take pictures with us a little bit later on. And maybe something to take a note with, and then your camera, because you should be able to follow on your camera, and a lot of the functions are the same. If you have a Canon, a Nikon, a Fuji, the Sony, they all do the same exact thing. They just have, some of them have a little bit more advantages than others, or different features, and the more money you spend, the more of those features you're going to get to utilize. So, so if we're talking about this camera here in particular, the A6000, it's a pretty simple camera. There's a lot of features on these cameras that are not necessarily all that important. You get your tooth out? Sweet. Here, come show them your camera. I'm going to show. You can't see with that.
No, where is it? Yeah.
Let's see.
No, where is your tooth?
Let me see your tooth.
Mom just took it.
Let me see your tooth. Oh, that's the second tooth, the bottom 2 teeth. See, there you go. Sweet. So, all right, so you can see here on the top of the camera, the things we talked about earlier are aperture, shutter speed, and the third tertiary item for making the photograph brighter, darker, so on and so forth is really going to be ISO. And that's, I always say use ISO last. ISO is like a digital electronic amplification of the photo to make it brighter. So it's not really what you want to utilize to take your picture. It should always be like a crutch to get a little bit more light out of your image. And it's really kind of focused on using in lower light scenarios more so than higher in or brighter scenarios. And the reason for it is the higher your ISO is, the more it's kind of like a copy of a copy. Or gain. Whenever you amplify sound too much, it starts breaking up. Whenever you increase the image brightness based digitally, it degrades as the higher you go. Or if you ever see like optical zoom versus digital zoom, optical zoom is what you want because it's basically it's infinite. It's the more of a focus or a zoom you have or a telescope, the better the image quality will be at a further distance. Whereas like digital is taking that photo and it's blowing it up digitally, so it's limited to how many pixels and the resolution of the image. So that's kind of what ISO is. It's the brightness or the amplification of the image exposure or brightness to make it a brighter image. It's really kind of like a thing to help assist get a brighter image. And the higher end cameras have better ISOs. You can go really, really high and you don't really get a lot of digital breakdown or a lot of, they call it noise. It looks like, you know, sand or like an image that looks grainy. That's considered noise, and you get that from ISO. So y'all let me know if y'all have any issues with the sound. I can turn the volume up a little bit. I know the neighbors are all mowing the yards right now because there's nothing much else to do. So we'll start off with Aperture. I'll go through Aperture and I'll talk about what Aperture's used for, what shutter used for, and we kind of just discussed ISO, but I'll give you some examples of why ISO would be used, not just what it's used, you know, what its definition is, but why I would actually use it. So we talked about aperture. Aperture would be the opening and closing, how wide the doorway is versus how small the doorway is. Shutter speed is more so, it's not the shutter speed, how fast it moves. A lot of people think that shutter speed's how fast the shutter moves. It's actually how long. It's actually, shutter speed should be shutter duration or shutter time. How long the shutter is open, allowing the light that's passing through the lens to hit the sensor. Film back in the day was a sensor. A digital sensor now is a sensor. So that's what the shutter does. So if you have the shutter open for 1 second, it's going to let in so much light. If you have the shutter open for 2 seconds or 1/10 of a second or 1,000th of a second, obviously 1,000th of a second is faster than a second, so it's going to be a lot quicker duration. So it's going to let light in a lot quicker for a shorter period of time, and then you get your exposure based off of that. So if you look at the camera here, the only real important camera modes for anybody who wants to learn how, good, I'm glad to hear that, Angie. The only thing that's really important on your camera setting modes as far as aperture and shutter speed and all that stuff is the different types of modes. So you can see right here I have the camera set to manual mode. That's going to give you full control over every single feature your camera can do. It's going to adjust your aperture, you can adjust your shutter speed, you can change your ISO, your focus area, the focus type, all kinds of different things, all kinds of different features that your camera has. On my camera or Sony cameras, they use S for shutter. On a lot of other cameras, you might see a TV. Like I think it's time variable is what the TV stands for. Basically, time, shutter, and time is the same thing. And then you have aperture here. And on other cameras like Canon and Nikon, I believe they actually have AV on their cameras. So that's how you know the three main camera modes. Program is kind of like in between, like aperture priority or shutter priority and automatic modes. It will control the aperture and the shutter for you, but it'll give you some other features like you can adjust focus maybe or ISO or certain things. And every camera manufacturer is different on what they allow you guys to adjust whenever you're using program mode. I don't really ever use it. I know there's some photographers that use it, but I'm usually strictly an aperture priority or a manual mode shooter almost all the time. So what's the difference? That's what a lot of people always ask me. All these other modes, I mean, these modes are useful, but they're just features. You could really just strip every single one of these off and just leave these three, and you're going to have a full functioning camera that's going to do 99% of what any photographer is going to need their camera to do. You can see there's like a movie mode here. Obviously, if I want to go to movie mode, it's going to put the camera in a movie mode to take video. Some cameras have a button on them. This one does in particular. You can see a little red button here. It'll let you just push that button and you'll go into video recording mode. Some cameras will require you to be in video mode. It just depends on the camera itself. And then you have scene mode. And I'll show you guys a little bit of what each of these do based off the camera's description. So as you see, you know, manual mode, you adjust aperture and shutter speed manually. Yeah, we talked about that. And you can shoot images, trailing motion. That's good to know, whatever. You have complete control over your camera basically in this mode. Shutter mode, basically you get control over the shutter. You say, I want, you know, manual mode, you're going to adjust both. And there's going to be a button on your camera that's going to indicate what you're actually going to, how you're going to adjust your shutter versus how you're going to adjust your aperture. When you're in shutter priority mode, you only have control over your shutter speed. So why is shutter priority important, or why is shutter mode important? Maybe the camera's going to adjust the exposure, I should say, on everything. It's going to do a lot of the things for you, but it's letting you decide what the shutter is going to be. So you say, hey, I want the shutter speed to be this fast or this slow, and you figure out the rest, okay? And it'll adjust the aperture and the ISO accordingly. So it'll let you know. I'm going to turn these pumps off. All the pool pumps are coming on at the same time. So you basically decide what the shutter is going to be, and you say, I want the shutter speed. Maybe you're doing like a night trail photography. You probably do manual, but maybe you're doing something with action where your kids are running around, and you want to have a very fast shutter because when you're in automatic camera mode, maybe it's picking a slower shutter and everybody when they move, it's blurry. Now maybe it's not quite as crisp or sharp, and sometimes people will mistake focus for blur, and they'll think that their camera's out of focus when it's really, maybe it's the shutter speed is too slow. So aperture priority. Now the same thing with shutter speed. You're saying, I want to pick the aperture, I want this particular aperture, and the camera can decide everything else. It'll decide what the shutter is going to be. It'll decide what the ISO is going to be to get the image bright or as dark as it needs to be. So that's kind of the differences in the main modes. A lot of these other intelligent modes, I'm not even going to go over because every single camera is different what they do. But just some examples of why you would be aperture priority. If you're a portrait photographer, a lot of portrait photographers will be interested in aperture, mostly because they are photographing a subject. And when you're photographing a person, and maybe you don't want the super busy background to be visible, you don't want it to be like, oh, I can see the trash in the yard or the people at the park in the background. You want them to be slightly blurry or out of focus, and so you would work on focus on aperture priority or aperture mode for that. You'd be focused on what your aperture is going to be based off of that desire. Or if you're shooting shutter priority, maybe you're trying to do maybe somebody's spinning. You've seen those photographs where people are spinning like the steel wool on fire, and it looks like a continuous circle, and you can see the tracers where people will draw their names with like with a sparkler or something like that. That's because they were shooting in some kind of shutter or manual mode where they had a very slow shutter, and when the camera opened up its shutter, they started doing their thing, drawing their name, and then by the time the shutter closed, they were finished drawing their name. And so it captures everything that hits the sensor over a duration of time. So maybe something like that might be like a 5-second exposure to draw their name, and you're going to see all of it. Now, if they have a super small pinhole aperture or a super wide aperture, or the ISO's too high, they could have a duration that would capture the duration of them doing it, drawing their name, but maybe the photo's still too bright or too dark. So it's all about that balance. So in shutter, Dream's asking a little bit about low light. That would be an example of when I would be focused on shutter speed, shutter duration, more so than aperture. For example, I'm sure some people might have saw some photos that I took when I was in New York for work, or if I'm at a wedding. You'd be interested in low light shutter focus at low light if it's something like a stationary object. And if you go, the rule for camera lenses, or the rule for how slow a shutter speed can be before you see blur, is usually like if you have a 50 millimeter, that's a focal length, or 100 millimeter, this is actually a 135 millimeter lens. So the general rule of thumb, depending on your camera, you wouldn't want to be any slower than 135 millimeter, you wouldn't want to have a slower duration of like 1/25th, essentially, is the equivalent. Whatever your focus distance is or your focal length is, you convert that to shutter speed. So 135, or like a 50 millimeter, for example. This is a 55 millimeter lens, but I wouldn't want to shoot with any slower of a shutter than 1/50th of a second. A 100 millimeter lens or a 90 millimeter lens like this one, it's kind of like if you've ever looked through a telescope and you barely like hit it, like you might be focused on a star or the moon, and if you barely move it a little bit, you lose exactly where the star was, or whatever, or binoculars, you lose what you were looking at because it was so far away. Everything's kind of exaggerated on this. So if you have a focus on something and you're taking pictures and you're moving around, obviously every single movement you're doing is going to cause a blur, because it's going to capture a slower shutter. Let's just say I'm looking at here, and then I move only a little bit, but I move a little bit over the course of a 50th of a second, right? And it's going to capture everywhere my finger or my subject was during that 50th of a second. During the whole time the shutter was open, it's going to catch all the movement that occurred. So the faster the shutter speed, the more things will be frozen in time. If you're photographing jets at an air show and you're doing this number, you can't be at a 50th of a second or a 10th of a second or 1 second, obviously, because you're going to capture, unless your hand's really steady, but you're going to capture a lot of blur, or even if you're stationary and the plane flies through it, you're going to capture from the point the shutter opened to when it closed, and a slower shutter speed, you might capture a longer duration of time and you'll see a blur, right? Or when I'm shooting air shows, I'm like at 4,000th of a second or 8,000ths of a second, like the max my camera will go as far as speed goes. So shutter is really, really important for allowing photo over time, like, you know, maybe nighttime photography, or like when you see the photographs of car tracers and things like that going through the streets. That's because they set up on a tripod, so there's no movement. They set their aperture based off their focal, how deep they wanted their focus to be, which for nighttime stuff and with a wide-angle lens, it's not as important. But the shutter speed's important. So maybe I'm capturing cars go down the street over the course of a minute or 30 seconds or 10 seconds. You're going to see a lot of the star trace. You're going to see from the moment that 30 seconds opened up the shutter, however far that car traveled in the brake lights, you're going to see the whole track basically. And that's where shutter speed would be important. Or if you're photographing people in a sports arena, or people are moving around playing basketball or football, it'd be more important to be focused on shutter speed or shooting manual. That way you know for certain that you're going to capture the action. You don't want to have a really awesome shot and then the person's hands blurry because you captured the whole movement of them doing this over the course of like 1,000th of a second. So that's kind of why shutter is important. So on this camera in particular, and anybody else's camera, if you have one in front of you, you can see they probably have some manual mode, aperture mode, and shutter priority mode. Those are the three things that I'm focused on explaining to people, because that's where you really want to learn your camera. That's where you understand how your camera operates. And we'll put some things to the test. I'll have Adeline come over and be my little model here in a second. So things to think about with aperture, and in photographing people, aperture is important because you want it affects. Shutter affects the duration of time, all right? So you get motion blur or lack of motion blur, or crisp sharpness in the image. Whereas aperture, it has influence on depth of field. So what is depth of field? You want to take some pictures with me? Yeah. Can I have you take your glasses off when I take your pictures so I can see your beautiful eyes? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna get you a chair and I'll sit you right here, and then I'll use you as my little model. Give me 1 second. Okay. Got caught up on you. That way you don't have to stand there the whole time. All right. There you go. So I'll use Adeline as my subject. Well, you can take pictures too. You can go stand with her. All right. Let's see. So what I'm going to use, I'm going to go and I'm going to bust out a drink first. I'm going to use a wide angle lens, and I'm going to show you the difference. Well, you know what? Let's do a 90, because 90 is a really good sharp lens. And we'll talk about lenses at the end. Right now we're just kind of focused on what aperture does, what shutter does, and finding the balance between the two. Like I said, I am literally using my wife's camera. Let's see. All right, sweetheart.
What do you want me to do?
You're good right there.
Okay.
So, as you can see, there's Adeline, as beautiful as she wants to be, right? And let me set my camera up to, I'm just gonna do this. I'm just gonna give you an example of what a wide aperture, what effect that has on the photograph versus a tiny aperture. So when you're looking at your camera lens, you'll see on your camera, it'll say, or on your lens, I'm sorry, because the equipment are two separate items, the lens and the camera. I'm using these pro level camera lenses on my wife's camera because they have the same mount. That means that they attach the same way. Canon has their own proprietary mount. Nikon has their own. Sony. They have different adapters you can plug in to one another. But as you can see right there, it says FE. That just has nothing to do with the camera's functionality. More so, it's a full frame camera lens. We're not going to get into full frame camera lenses versus crop camera lenses today. But you can see it says f2.8 and it's a 90 macro. So the most important things for me right now is that it's f2.8. That's in Aperture. That's its limitation or its capability as an Aperture, and it's a 90 millimeter. So a 90 millimeter is typically a longer focal length. I try to explain to people that what you see in the, when you look with your human eye, it's about 50 millimeter. So that's why 50 millimeter lenses or nifty 50s are so popular, is because if you pull the camera up to your face on a full frame camera, not a crop camera, this is actually a crop camera, but on a full frame camera, you pull a 50 millimeter lens up to your eye, it doesn't appear, the image won't appear as if it gets any closer or any further away to you. If I pull a 90 millimeter or a longer focal length camera lens up to my face, it's going to bring whatever I'm looking at closer to me. So I'll give you an example. I'm going to look at Adeline, and this is 90 millimeters, right? So she's a decent ways away from me. She's about 8-9 feet away from me, 7-8-9 feet away from me, and she's a lot closer to me. If I swap out to a, you're going to see a white screen, so just give it a second. If you swap to a 28 millimeter, she is further away from me. Does that make sense? So a wider angle is going to have more of the scene in the image by nature of it being a wide angle, but it's also going to make your subject further away. And if you swap back to the 90 millimeter, she's a lot closer to me now. Beautiful girl. So right now on this camera, as I discussed before, its aperture is 2.8 and it's 90 millimeters. So the 90 millimeters is the focal length. Look at this camera lens I just showed you guys. You can see right here, it's a full frame lens. That's just Sony's designator is FE, and it's an f2. That means it has that capability of opening its aperture a little bit more, and it's a 28 millimeter. So you can see that there. You can jump over to the 55 here. Same thing on my camera. It's FE full frame. It does usually the 1,8 is 1.8, so that's an aperture. It's even a little bit, it's a third of a stop wider than f2. I'll get into that here in a little bit. And then it's also a 55 millimeter. So basically this is going to be a more longer focal length. This is going to be a little bit less, and that 28 millimeter is going to be quite a bit wider. So that's kind of the differences. And if you see, all the lenses are the same. They have a way of annotating what they are. Full frame, 1.8, so it has the same aperture capability as the other lens, but it's 85. It's a little bit longer focal length, but a little bit than the 55, but a little bit shallower than this one. This one has a designator as being a macro lens, and macro lens just means you essentially can get closer to the subject. There's going to be limitations on how close your lens can get to the subject, and you can get like 1-to-1. If you photograph an ant, it's going to be as close as you could see to the human as your human eye could get to it, essentially. But they're made for like detailed photography, getting close to something. Small photos of flowers or ring shots at weddings. That's usually my workhorse here. But this is a really sharp lens. I use it a lot for portraits too. So, Adeline, you ready? We're going to jump through the apertures. I'll give you an example of what the differences are. So this is at f2.8. I don't have. There you go. I don't have the stats on the screen. I'm just going to explain them to you now, and then we'll talk about them later. So she's at f2.8, which is as wide open as this lens will allow me to shoot. It's not a camera limitation. It can be a lens limitation. So the aperture, how wide your aperture or how small your aperture is going to be, is based off of a limitation of your lens, not your camera. So if I take a picture of her right here, you can see the background. I'm going to focus on her, and I'm going to look around. Let me change the focus mode real quick. Focus. Wait, wrong. Sorry, I've got to figure this out over here. I don't use Allison's camera all that often, so there we go. So let's do single. So why is it going to focus? I'll just leave it there. So I focused on her face. The camera automatically focused on her face. You can see the background, right? It's super blurry. It's out of focus. You can tell there's stuff back there, but it's fairly out of focus. And it basically separates her from the background. It makes her stand out more so. The more blurry the background is, the more more she's pronounced. So if I start changing my shutter speed, or my aperture, and go to a really tiny hole, so to speak, small aperture. I'll go f/22. I'm pretty sure, I don't think, oh yeah, it does. Okay, cool. So if I do this now, and I look around, she's in focus. I didn't mean to do that. She's in focus. You can see the details behind her. I'm not focused on that. I'm focused on her, as you can still see. See, look at me, Adeline, smile. All right, you're good. You don't have to smile anymore. All this stuff in the background is still pretty discernible. It's because the smaller the opening on the lens, or the higher the number. So this one's f/22 versus when we were shooting before, it was f/28. So it's a smaller number, but the smaller number means that the aperture is actually larger, and the larger number actually means the aperture is smaller, like a pinhole. So now back to f/20 or f/2.8. Everything in the background is super out of focus. Does that make sense? So that's why there is the advantage to aperture priority, or being interested in your aperture, is because now you can use it for portraits more, and you can separate your subject from the background. Hey, Adam, will you stand up right here in this opening? Back up a little bit, and I'm going to give you. There you go. That's a good example. So right now the background's pretty out of focus at f/28. I would be shooting in aperture priority mode as a wedding photographer or a portrait photographer, and you can see Adeline is separated from the background. If I go back to f/22, this is two opposite ends of this lens's capability, and I focus on her and I take the picture, you can see now that everything in the background is discernible. I know there's a fence there, so that is where the advantage to adjusting your aperture over your shutter speed, what impact aperture has on the camera or on the photo versus what impact shutter speed has on the camera. So there's your aperture. Okay, Adeline, you can sit down, baby. Does that make sense? Any questions on that so far? There's a little bit of delay on the YouTube, so you might not be able to see the differences. So I'm gonna bust out. Let me set this up real quick so you can see what I see on my camera, and then I'm going to explain the differences. You know, knowing that there is a difference in aperture but not understanding the numbers is kind of arbitrary. So I'm going to go in here to remote display, turn on. All the Sony cameras do this. There's a little bit of delay. I turn my display on so you guys can see, and I can't see on my camera, so I got to use my screen for the system as an indicator. So as you can see at the bottom of the screen, I'm at f/28. She's going to be in focus, and everything in the background is going to be out of focus. I'm not too worried about the actual photograph right now, but you can see that that's the difference. Yeah, so right now ISO's at 1600 because I have the shutter speed at 1000. If I was shooting, and this is just aperture, this is the camera is making a decision on what it thinks the shutter speed should be and what the ISO should be. And so this is kind of one of those things that's not necessarily a benefit to use a priority mode instead of a manual mode. Let me get like a wide angle lens on here so I can just show you guys. I just want to click through the f-stops and the shutter speeds and all that stuff so you guys can see. All right, watch out, Cora. I'm gonna put this right here, sweetie. All right, I'm just gonna use this to steady my hand because it's kind of hard to hold this thing steady. All right, so right now the camera, and part of what I'm seeing on my screen is covered up by some of the data on here, but basically right now, all right, I'm just trying to catch up with a delay. Let the camera sit there for a second. So as I change my f-stop, basically the camera is making adjustments to the ISO, as you can see. So if I go back down to f/28, I'm in aperture priority mode. Remember, I'm telling the camera that I want to control the aperture, the opening of the lens, and it can figure out the rest. And that's what it's doing. So right now, it's at f2, this lens has a little bit higher capability. It's adjusting, and I think, let me see if that's exposure compensation. Sorry, there's a delay, so whenever I adjust something, I have to wait and make sure it clicks before I do something else. I think on this camera I can turn down the ISO. No, it's going to make that decision. Oh yeah, there it is. So right now, let me see. What I would usually do if I'm shooting outdoors and I don't need any ISO, since we're not needing that. Remember, we're talking about aperture and shutter only right now. We don't care about ISO. We only care about shutter and aperture. I would have the camera set to the minimum. I don't need the camera to help me brighten the image because I'm not at the limits of my shutter speed. I'm not at the limits of my aperture. So right now, starting from a base f2, widest open this particular lens will go. If I start upping it up 1, 2, 3 clicks, I think I hit 4. If I go to 2.8, which is one stop, one measure, one increment, one full increment, smaller aperture, it's going to adjust things. So now it's at 1/320th of a second. If I go back down to f2, we'll see what it says, 1/500th of a second. So the camera, when you're shooting in aperture priority or any kind of automatic priority mode, it's trying to expose the image based off of how bright or dark it thinks it needs to be. It's a computer. It doesn't know the human eye. You maybe want a really dark, moody image or a really bright, airy photograph. It doesn't know that. It's going to make a decision based off of trying to have a gray image. So the cameras look at 18% gray. It's kind of a scientific, mathematical thing. It's like a medium gray color. It's basically looking at all the bright and all the dark in the image, and it's trying to balance an exposure in between at 18%. What that means, look it up on Google. Spend some time looking at 18% gray. Just know that it's looking at what it thinks is bright or dark enough. So right now it's saying at f2 I need to be at like 1/500th of a second, 1/640th, whatever of a second to get this image properly exposed. And I'm pretty sure I'm at exposure compensation 0. Let me make sure. No, 0.3, okay. So right now it's making this decision. If I say, hey, I want the aperture to be, I want to see a little bit more of the background back there. I want to see a little bit more of the tree. I want a little bit more of those things to be in focus. I'm going to go 2 stops. I'm going to go from f2 to f4. That's 2 stops. Now the focus, the background is a little bit more pronounced. You can see it. Now it's saying I need to slow the shutter down. I need to have it open longer, essentially, to let more light in, because whenever you close down the opening of the aperture, the image is going to get darker naturally, so it needs to increase the shutter duration to be open longer to let light in for a little bit longer time, and therefore brighten the image. If I continue to go, one more stop or 3 clicks on your camera to 5/6, these are all the major full f stops. It's going to go down to 1/80th of a second. If I go one more stop, 7/1/8, there we go, and it'll go down to 1/30th of a second. So every stop that I increase or decrease the aperture size smaller, it's going to compensate, as you can see, by slowing the duration or lengthening the duration that the shutter is open. Does that make sense? Same with shutter priority mode. If I go to shutter priority mode, we're going to swap over to shutter priority mode. Tells you a little bit of a detail thing here on the Sony. You can turn that off. Now when I make adjustments with the same dial on my camera, if I go and increase the shutter speed to 500th of a second, you can see the f-stop over there. I'm making it slower duration of time, or longer duration of time. The lens is going to be open long, the shutter's going to be open longer. Now it's going to compensate by closing down the aperture to restrict the amount of light coming in, trying to balance it out. So that is the difference between aperture priority and shutter priority mode. You decide the aperture. I'm using the same dial on this camera to change the aperture as I am the shutter. When I go to aperture priority mode, that dial adjusts the aperture. When I go to shutter priority mode, that dial adjusts the shutter. And it's going to be different on your camera, but you'll have to use your owner's manual. A lot of people ask, like, how do they get to know how there are different modes? Like, open your owner's manual. It'll really tell you a lot. Some of it's in like jargon that you may not understand, but a lot of it explains things. And on the Sony cameras in particular, I know Canon and Nikon's point and shoot cameras, they have, when you go to a certain mode, it'll tell you. You might see like candlelight mode, you might see like sports mode. All a sports mode or a candlelight mode is the same thing as an aperture priority or shutter priority. It's basically setting candlelight, it's low light, it's dark. So it's setting your aperture to be open more, to let more light in, and it's setting your shutter speed to be slower. So longer opening shutter so that you can brighten the image because you're trying to photograph things in low light. Sports, it's going to probably have a more smaller aperture so you can have more things in focus, and then you also want it to be a faster shutter speed. So it's kind of presetting things based off of what most photographers would want in an action setting. It wants a fast shutter and a small aperture, a small pinhole or a more depth of field. So when we talked about Adeline, being in focus, that's what depth of field is. So based off of where I focus this camera, I'm gonna go back to aperture priority mode. Once I go into that particular focus area, I don't even know where the focus is at. Okay, here we go. So now Adeline's camera or lenses, come on you. I think I'm too close with that lens. Give me a second. All right. It's wanting to bite off. Okay, cool. So if I'm in this focus, you can see as I change, everything's going to get more out of focus. See how that works? That's actually a really good example. Single shot. You watching, Adeline? As I had the lens is open as wide as it can. It makes the depth of focus shallower. That means that, if I put my finger right here, it's out of focus. As I get the area or the plane of focus is thin. It's probably like, there's a scientific equation. It's a very, very small depth. It means like if I have something a little bit further back than where it's focused at, it's going to be out of focus. If I come a little bit too close, it's going to be out of focus. As I start closing down the aperture and everything in the background becomes more in focus, now if I put my finger right here, it's going to be in focus still, relatively more in focus than it was before. It's going to take more of an adjustment towards the camera or more of an adjustment away from the camera because now that depth of field is thicker. It's wider. It ends back here and it ends up here. Everything in between is going to be in focus. Whereas when you go to a smaller aperture, it doesn't take very far of a deviation from wherever the focus is at for it to be out of focus again. Now my finger's out of focus again. Does that make sense? I know I'm asking questions and you may have a delay before you guys have it. Write it down. If you don't know, we'll cover it again. So that's aperture priority, and that's what aperture is adjusting. So right now I'm wide open. You can see clearly as I adjust the aperture to a smaller pinhole or a larger number, everything's in focus. If I adjust it back to wide open aperture, everything is becoming more out of focus. So right now the background's probably in focus. Let's adjust the focus. There we go. And what it's doing is it's trying to find a focal point. So yeah, so as I adjust it's focused back there, so everything outside of where it's focused is going to be more out of focus. If I stop it down to f22, now there's more in focus. It's because the focal distance is so far away, the glasses are still slightly out of focus. But if I go back down to this, now it's almost like shit disappears. So that's basically aperture in a nutshell. That's what aperture affects. I hope you guys are having drinks. I'm gonna do something real quick as we get darker. You can stand right there, Adeline, behind the chair. I'm just adjusting the aperture here, or my ISO a little bit to brighten the image. So people may ask, like, how do you know how much adjustments your camera's making whenever you make it? Every single click on your camera, if you push the button and you feel that click, whether it be your aperture dial or your shutter dial, most cameras are by default set to be 1/3 of a stop. So when we talked about stops before, we talked about it's an f2, f1.4, f2.8. There's an f-stop chart, and f2.8, f2, those numbers really don't matter all that much. It's just a frame of measurement for how much light a lens lets in. So when we were shooting really wide open and it was super out of focus, on her glasses and her sitting over there on the chair, that was f2. That was a full stop. So if I wanted to go from f2, one full stop, smaller aperture, I want to go from f2 to f2.8. If I want to go from f2.8 to one full stop, smaller aperture, I would go from f2.8 to f4, and then it goes 5, 6, and 8. And so when you play with your camera and you look at your lenses, you'll see every time you click, it's going to give you a third of a stop. So it's going to be like f2 to f2.2. I think it's f2, 2.5, and then 2.8. So you don't need to memorize those, but know that if I have an exposed image and everything looks really good on the photograph, and I say I want to adjust my aperture, say I want to open up the aperture a little bit wider because I want the background to be a little bit more out of focus. If I'm in manual mode and I make it wider open, it's going to let more light in. So if I go from f2.8 to f2, it's going to make it one stop brighter. And what one stop means, one stop is twice as much or half as much of whatever your previous setting was. So if I took a picture of Adeline or myself right now, I'm exposed and everything looks good, and I say I want to go from I think I'm at f2, and I think this lens is my 35-1.4. This is my baby. So if I go from 1.4, f2 down to 1.4 is one full stop. If I brighten up the image by opening the lens to 1.4, it's going to be twice as bright as it currently is. Or if I go from f2 to f2.8, which is smaller aperture, lets less light in, it's going to be half as much light. So if I do that, well, what do I got to do to adjust the brightness again? I can do two different things. I can adjust my shutter like the aperture priority mode was doing, or shutter priority mode was doing. I can say, hey, I'm going to let the aperture be a little bit brighter. Now the photograph's too bright. Then I would have to go down to be exactly the same exposure as it was before. It's like science. I have a mathematical equation. I have to bring the shutter speed one stop faster. So when we're talking about aperture and shutter and the different stops, we saw f1.4, f2, f2.8, f4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22. Basically going through all the different stops, the third of stops is how you're adjusting the measurement of exposure or how much light's letting in. So if you open it a stop, you're going to have to inversely darken it a stop for it to be the same exposure. If it was already too exposed or underexposed and it doesn't matter, then you're going to have to adjust your shutter and all that accordingly. But if you're messing with shutter, if I want to go from 100 to one stop slower, or let the shutter be open for twice as long, then obviously twice as long as 1/100th of a second is going to be a 50th of a second. So 1/50th of a second would be one stop slower shutter than 1/100th of a second. If I wanted to go from 1/100th of a second to twice as fast of a shutter, or half as much light as the 1/100th of a second was letting in, then I would go from 1/100th of a second to 1/200th of a second. So if I have a couple screens here, I'm kind of clicking through. You can't all see them, but I'll show you real quickly. It mostly focus on the actual bottom of the screen. So I'm at 1/100th of a second. If I want to go 1, 2, 3 clicks, now I'm at 2/100th of a second. If I want to go one stop faster shutter speed, 1, 2, 3 clicks of a stop, 400th. So obviously, if I'm at 3/20th of a second in my aperture or my shutter speed, and I want to go twice as long, then I would go from 1, 2, 3, 3/20th of a second down to 1/60th of a second. So that's kind of how the stops work in shutter priority or shutter mode, your shutter stops versus your aperture stops. So so the question came up earlier, if I wanted to photograph Adeline you know, out here running around, or a ceiling fan, just lay in your bed at night, or in sometime with some light. You don't want to do it just in a dark room because you don't have to other variables to adjust. But if you lay your ceiling fan, or what you could also do is turn your faucet on in your kitchen, like just enough to where like the water is like dripping out, and like almost to the point where it's a continuous stream but not quite, and then adjust your shutter speed on your camera. Go to shutter priority mode and play with shutter priority mode and set your shutter to like, you know, 1,000th of a second. and then adjust it to 500th of a second, and then shorten it half of that and go like 2/50th of a second, and then, you know, so on and so forth, and see what adjusting the shutter speed does for your image. You might capture like the droplet in a faster shutter speed, and then when you go to like a slower shutter speed, like a second or a tenth of a second, you might actually just see like those waterfall photos where it looks like milk. It's because the photograph, the shutter was open over the course of time, and it captured all that water as it moved over a tenth of a second or a fifth of a second, and so you get that motion over time. So that's kind of where shutter priority is important. So if you go to manual mode, which we talked about before, then you're going to adjust everything. You're going to adjust the shutter, you're going to adjust the aperture, you have control over everything. So just some key points. The aperture, we talked about the f-stops. All the clicks on your camera by default are going to be a third of a stop. So does that matter that much? Not really when you're first starting to learn, but as you start adjusting, if I'm at a wedding and I do something with my strobe lights or my speed lights, and I do something with my aperture, and I darken the image for depth of field or for shutter speed or something like that, and then I need to compensate to get it back to where it was brightness wise, and I know that I have to click, 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 or click, click, whatever I did as far as clicks on my camera to compensate for what I lost in exposure. So same with shutter speed. You have different shutter speeds. 1/duration of time. 1/100th of a second. It's all based off of a second. So if you see 1/1, that's 1 second. If you see, it'll say it'll just say 1 second, or it'll say 2 second, 5 second, whatever your duration is on your camera. Depth of field is what aperture focuses on. No pun intended, but that's what that's what it brings to the game. It makes the focus shallower whenever the lens is wide open, and it makes everything in focus when everything's super small aperture. And it's confusing. The larger the number, the smaller the aperture. The smaller the number, f2.8, f1.14, f2, the wider the aperture, the more light it's letting in. And the purpose for a smaller aperture may be landscape photography, or maybe if I'm a macro photographer when I'm shooting rings, if I was to be really close to something, of course it emphasizes the out of focusness of everything else. Macro lenses, when you're getting really close to something you're photographing, if you take your finger and you put it up to your face, everything by nature in the background becomes out of focus. As you move it further away, everything in the background becomes more in focus, because the distance that you're focused on your finger versus the distance of the background becomes closer together, therefore the focus becomes more concentrated. But when I'm shooting with a macro lens on a ring, sometimes if I'm really close to the ring, or I'm really close to something like a flower, maybe the pistil of the flower, or the one of the leaves or petals of the flower is in focus, but everything else in the flower is super out of focus. I may not want to shoot it f1.4 really close to something like that, or maybe I want the whole flower to be in focus, but I want everything else around the flower to be out of focus. Then I might go from like f2.8 to like 5.6 f8. I mean, I've shot f11 on a ring because I wanted all the cool details on this table and the background behind the ring to be in focus. And or maybe sometimes just if I have something that's like not completely perpendicular to me, like if the ring was perpendicular, like the diamond was perpendicular to me, the whole head of the diamond would be in focus and the rest of the ring would gradually get out of focus. But if I turn it catty corner, or I'm shooting at an angle, maybe that very tip of that corner is in focus of the ring, but everything else is out of focus. And so that might be why I want to have a deeper depth of focus, just so I can actually see the whole ring or most of the diamond. I'm not sure. I just have it set to standard video mode, Dream. I have to mess. The camera you were shooting with your daughter. The camera that I'm shooting my daughter with is the A6000. It's the one that I was talking about earlier. I know you said your camera fell out. This actually is a detachable lens camera, just like most people's newer point and shoot cameras. You can put different lenses on there. This is actually the lens that comes with it. It's actually a pretty decent kit lens. And that's a good point. So now that I'm thinking about it, all the lenses that we talked about, these are all fixed focus lengths. That means all the lenses that I have here, they don't zoom. They are, when I put them on my camera, where they're at is where they're at. So as you can see with this lens, if I can zoom it, it's got a digital zoom on it. So it's, as I zoom in and zoom out, the lens is, it's like a telescope, right? It's adjusting the elements of the lens away from each other and closer to each other, and it's what gets your focal length further and closer, zooming further and closer away from you. So this lens in particular says 3.5 to 5.6. So on these lenses before, these fixed lenses, it says 2.8. Now, that means no matter what I do, it's always going to be 2.8 because it doesn't zoom. Nothing changes in the internals on this lens other than the focus motor or the manual focus ring. Everything in here is the same. So no matter if I want to shoot f2.8, no matter what my shutter, no matter what, I can shoot 2.8. It's constant. Some zoom lenses are, and the more high dollar lenses, which most photographers use, are going to have f2.8, even if it has a zoom range on it. Like a 24 to 70 is a really popular, a 16 to 35 is a really popular zoom range, focal length distance. Those higher end lenses are going to be like f4 or f2.8. It's going to have the capability of shooting wide open, even if it's zoomed in. Whereas this lens in particular, or cheaper lenses, this basically means if I'm really wide angle, if I zoom all the way out and I can see more of the image, the lens is usually not as tunneled. It's not as long, essentially. When you see a lens get extended like that, it's usually because it's zooming. Well, obviously it places a tunnel between the outside light and the sensor, and it darkens the image. Obviously, now light's having to pass through a dark tunnel to get to the sensor. So when I'm wide open or wide angle, it's going to do 3.5. If I zoom in to its longest, that's at 16. So at 3.5 aperture, it'll open up as far as 3.5, which is still not that great, but it's not that bad either for a kit lens. At a wide angle, it's going to be 3.5. At 16 millimeter, 3.5 doesn't really matter unless you're really close to your subject. Everything's going to look and focus almost all the time. 5.6, if I zoom to 50 millimeter, it's going to go down to 5.6. So if I drop to this camera right here and show you guys just for example, and I have my aperture, let's go to aperture priority mode real quick. I go to aperture priority mode, and come on, sweetheart. All right. And let's see. And I have it set to wide angle as possible. I'm at 3.5 like it said on the lens, right? But as soon as I zoom in, you'll see that my f-stop is adjusting. Now it's saying I can only do 5.6. And that is as wide as aperture as I can get. Now, the longer your focal length, it kind of does the same thing as a wide aperture. If you start shooting a subject with a wide aperture, you get an out of focus background. You can see everything back here, you see my hand back here, is out of focus. As I zoom wider angle, my hand becomes more in focus. So, see how that works? So you can get a shallower depth of field or a shallower focus if you shoot like a telephoto, which is one reason why a lot of photographers like to shoot with portrait lenses. And a portrait lens would be this 90 millimeter macro, this 135 millimeter portrait lens. These are longer focal lengths, so by nature, even if I'm at like a f4 or a 5.6 with this particular lens, it's going to be, the background's going to still be pretty much separated from the subject. Because of that, you saw as I zoomed in longer zoom or focal length, my hand was out of focus more. So that's kind of why you hear portrait lens. So usually when you hear like landscape lens or landscape photographer, a wider angle, that's what they're talking about. Wider angle lens is going to be more of a landscape photographer lens because it's going to capture more of the scene. So a wider angle lens is considered landscape. Standard might be more of like in between, like 35 millimeter to 50 millimeter is kind of considered like in between the human eye, and then you start getting to 85 millimeter, 90, 135. Those are considered like portrait lenses. That's kind of the purpose of the different types of lenses. So f-stops, third stop, every click, depth of field, and people are usually focused on portraits when they're using aperture. I focus on aperture priority mode. I didn't spend this lens when I bought it was like $1,500, $600, maybe more. I didn't buy this lens to shoot at f22. I bought it to shoot at 1.8. You know, it's just a third of a stop wider aperture than f2. So it's beautiful. I'll show you here in a second with Adeline. It's meant for portraits. I mean, she's got to be further away from me because it obviously brings her really close to the camera because it zooms in, right? And it's fixed. I can't zoom out. So that's why people spend the money on those higher end lenses, because I want that that depth of field. But also when I'm shooting the low light wedding, the wider the aperture, I mean the shutter speed on your camera is fixed. Like you can't change your capability of your camera. Your camera has its shutter speed is slow, you know, down to like a seconds and 30 seconds and things like that, and 8,000th of a second. But your lens, on the other hand, is what brings a lot of the variability to your shooting. Because now when I'm in a low light scenario, let's just say it's super dark out here, and I have my shutter speed at 100th of a second at a wedding reception. If I go any slower than 100th of a second with mostly any camera and people are dancing around, the camera is open for 1/100th of a second, so it's going to capture all the motion. So a very active dance crowd, you're going to see lots of blur because people are moving over that duration of time. So if I want to go up to a faster shutter speed, I have to go from 100th of a second to like 200th of a second, which is usually where I'm at, because my flashes are usually limited to around that. That's a whole nother discussion, but I'm at 200th of a second. Well, it makes the image darker. So now I have to find ways, it's too dark. If I was to try to shoot 1/200th of a second inside a low light reception hall, and I couldn't shoot it at like 5/6 without off camera lighting, you know, flashes going off to brighten the image. If I wanted to shoot natural light, I'd have to like have my aperture open up really wide. Well, if I use this little lens here, it does 3.5. It sounds great, but it's you got to think. Let's say 5/6 to f4. That's twice as much light. So this lens doesn't do f4. It will do f4, but it's not its limitation. It doesn't even do 2.8, which is twice as bright as f4. It doesn't even do f2, which is twice as bright as f2.8. It does 1.8. So every time you go a stop, it's letting twice as much light. So 2 stops is like 4 times as much light. So it's quite a bit of a difference to have a lens that opens up really, really wide, because now you can actually get a lot more light out of your scene without having off-camera lighting, which is why those lenses are super expensive. If you're not shooting low-light stuff, you're shooting your backyard, going out with your kids and things like that, and sports practices, you don't need lenses that have that capability, other than if you really want that shallow depth of focus. With a wider angle lens, you're going to have to spend some money on it. If you want that shallow depth of focus, you can buy an 85mm. This is like a $300 lens right here. I mean, it seems like a lot, but this is nothing. The high-end 85mm Sony is like $1,500, $1,400. I don't even use it because it's like 2/3 of a stop brighter, and this thing is like, for me, it's just not worth it. For most of the time, I'm gonna have flashes at a wedding. I'm gonna use flashes. I don't need it, but it's super capable. A super capable lens, and it's a lot cheaper than buying the thousands of dollar lenses. Same thing. I went to the 55mm 1.8 instead of the 1.4 I had before, because it was like 1/3 the cost, and I wasn't necessarily needing the extra exposure on my photography. The only 2 lenses that I still have that are my old legacy Sony lenses are these 2 monsters. They actually have to have an adapter, which is what this is right here, to attach to my camera, because the old Sony Alphas use an A-mount lens, which is just a type of lens mount that they use. And I still want, they just recently came out with a couple of equivalent lenses that could replace these, and I just haven't done it yet. So that's Aperture. We talked about Aperture. I'll give you some examples of Aperture in a minute, kind of like we did before. Shutter speed, we talked about that. It's motion over time, and most people are focused on shutter for action shots. You know, you're concerned about the speed, shutter speed for action, or you're concerned with shutter speed for like stargazing, where you want to like capture like stars at night moving across the sky. You've seen those shots where it looks like all the stars are like moving in a circle. That's because they've captured multiple photos over time. Or even just getting photos of the Milky Way, you have to have a pretty long exposure, like in the tens of seconds. To get exposures like that, even with an f1.4 really wide open lens and my ISO all the way up to like 3200, which is me amplifying the brightness of the lens digitally in camera. I'll be maxed out, and I'll be at like 1/10 of a second or less, a second to 10 seconds, and you'll just enough to see the Milky Way. You have to be somewhere really, really dark. So that's the shutter speed, and that's the aperture. ISO, so let's just say that the importance of ISO. So Raymond was asking earlier, I was at 1600. I don't use my wife's camera for anything. This is the first time I've really used it in a long time, and I was trying to set everything up. The reason why ISO is important, if I'm at a wedding and I'm using my portrait lens, which is the one that's on the camera right now is a 35mm 1.4. That's one of my workhorses. But the other one would be like an 85 or the 135, and I'm maxed out. I'm at f1.8 or f2 or f1.4. Like my lens can't open up anymore. Can't let any more light in. And my shutter speed's at 100th of a second or 200th of a second. If I go any slower, it has to be for slower action. You know, maybe people just walking down the aisle. But reception halls get really dark. If I'm at those two settings, then the image is too dark. You wouldn't be able to see anything. It'd just be a black picture. So ISO basically takes the camera sensor. Most of them are calibrated for like 100, ISO 100 or ISO 200, and you're basically amplifying the digital image. You're saying, hey, whatever you're seeing, camera, I want to like amplify it. I want to boost it. I want you. And every camera has capabilities. This one's capability at like 800 ISO is like starts to look like garbage. So just as an example, you could shoot a photograph of something with high ISO and slow shutter speed. I mean, that's completely something you can do, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So we'll use this lens here. Let's go to manual mode. Let's bump my ISO up to, let's go 2000. And same here, every click is a third of a stop. So if I went from 1000 ISO and I wanted to go up to one more stop brighter, 1, 2, 3, it's 2000, as you would imagine. The numbers are pretty simple. So 2000 ISO, that's too bright, right? So I'm gonna have to compensate. Let's go ahead and let's do a faster shutter speed. Let's bring the shutter speed down. Let's just do 2000 on the shutter speed. Sorry, there's a little bit of a delay, so when I'm clicking, there we go. And then it's still too bright, right? It's like, no, that's still too bright. So now I'm gonna stop down the aperture down to like 5.6, probably a pretty good exposure. There you go. Let's do 5.6. All right, so if I take a picture, it looks fine on the back of the camera. You take a picture, and then you look at the photograph, and it may be easy to see, may not be easy to see, but there's a lot of grain. Let's see if I can get some of this grain to come up. It's actually not too horrible because there's a decent amount of light out here. But if I take this picture here, let's just max it out. Let's do a little bit more just so you can. I want you guys to really see what I mean with the ISO. You'll see the grain more in low light than you will in broad daylight. Well, let's just max it out. Let's just go to 256. This is going to be a really good example. And let's stop it down to f11, and then we'll do like 4000. I think is max on this camera. Okay, so we might have to do a 16. All right, now maybe we'll be able to see. Let's see. So Dream, the reason why you want ISO 2000 is like that example. Whenever my aperture, I'm trying to let light in, right? I'm trying to balance light, and if I want the light to be brighter or darker, or the image to be brighter or darker, I adjust that based off a longer shutter speed or faster shutter speed, wider aperture, smaller aperture. So as you should be able to see pretty easily there how grainy this image is now. There's less color. It's not as vibrant anymore. You can see all the digital breakdown. That's what ISO does, and it's more pronounced in low light. So there's a lot of light out here right now, but if we're out somewhere low light, you wouldn't see it. It's not as pronounced. There are definitely some differences in the image quality. There's a little bit more of like a blur to them, like the image looks kind of like foggy or murky looking. But if it's low light, you'll see a lot more noise or degradation in the image. You don't necessarily see it nearly as much in the daytime, but this just kind of gives you an example. So, I'm sorry, Angie asked this. So Angie's my aunt, so hey Angie. If you were at a wedding or somewhere where low light or we're indoors, outside is bright, outside the light's ample. But if you go indoors, even a hotel room or your living room, a lot of people like their curtains drawn. If you go indoors and you have maybe you don't have a lens that does f1.4. Maybe your lens is limited to like 3.5, like my wife's lens is on this camera right now. If I go inside and I have my aperture open as wide as I can, and I'm trying to capture movement or the kids are walking around, or you know, it's not just like something I'm on using a tripod. Maybe my shutter speeds at like, you'll notice even at like 100th of a second to like 500th of a second, sometimes that's too slow or too fast of a duration, and you'll still see, it'll still be dark inside your house. So you'll be wide open aperture and you'll have your shutter speed at 500th of a second, and it'll still be too dark. Well, then that's when you would use ISO. So if we were indoors, I'd show you. I don't want to bring everything inside, but let me go bump this back up. Let me get my ISO back to a manageable level. So usually for me at a wedding, when I'm inside and I'm at 1.4 or f2, so the two lowest stops most lenses are using, and I'm shooting 100th of a second or 200th of a second, 99% of the time I'm at either ISO 1000 to ISO 1600, because that's what my particular camera, it does really well. It doesn't get grainy until like, you know, 4000 or more, 3200 or more. Then it starts getting kind of grainy. But I want the best images that I can give my clients, so I don't want to shoot a high ISO and induce noise or, you know, image breakdown. I want to shoot lowest ISO as possible, so that's why I have to invest in lenses. If I had a kit lens is like a reference for a lens that basically is a entry-level lens, like what would come on this camera. If I was to shoot a wedding with at 5.6 or 3.5, there's no way I'd be able to do under 2000 ISO. There's just no way. It's just the lens and the camera at 3.5 and like 100th to 200th of a second, at 3.5 or smaller aperture, the image is going to be super, super dark. You're not going to be able to see much detail, especially in a darker reception. Now that's going to be completely dependent. It depends on the environment. Like right now we're outside. If right now, like you saw how I went over there and I had to adjust the camera to up the exposure because it's getting darker now and the overcast is becoming a little bit more significant. If it was to be bright and sunny right now, I'd have to make adjustments to my camera to get the exposure dimmer because now it's going to be too bright. So it's just all about a balance. And the reason why I said before I like the Sony lenses and the Sony cameras and the mirrorless, I should say, is because you get the opportunity to see what you're messing with. So if you adjust the aperture or you adjust the shutter, you get immediate feedback. You don't have to take a picture and look at the camera, take a picture, look at the camera. You can say, oh, it's too dark, it's too bright. And you kind of learn what your aperture is doing, and you can kind of see it go up and down as you make adjustments. So Dragos, a good buddy of mine, he kind of reiterated what I just said. I think he said it before I did actually, but yeah, when you're in darker environments, the higher ISO, the noise and the degradation of the image with the higher ISO is more pronounced when there's less light. I had to bump the ISO up on that thing to 256,000, which is like unheard of. No one would ever shoot in that, and it still didn't look horrible. But because it's amplified, digital amplified upon amplified upon amplified, you start losing crispness in the image. You get the detail breakdown. You lose contrast and clarity and color saturation in your images. So that's the big thing. Do I use any non-fixed fast lenses for weddings? I do not use any non-fixed lenses anymore, Raymond. I used to shoot with a 16 to 35. 16 was too wide. 20 or 16 to 24. I used to shoot with one of those. Or was it 16 to, I think it was 16 to 35. I had a 24 to 70 a long time ago. I have just found I really, really like the Zeiss lenses. I like the color, and I've kind of turned to a snob. I can actually see a color difference between a Zeiss lens. There's just something about the color in the Zeiss lenses, which is why I like them. And the overall quality, there's less moving parts in a fixed lens. They typically have a better overall quality than a fixed lens. More moving parts, every single thing gets out of place over time. You drop it, bump it. The focus motors, the element placement inside the lens, all those different things over time could cause a lens to need to be adjusted or refocused. Probably more often than the fixed lenses do. But the biggest reason why I don't use zoom lenses anymore is because I find that I am a better photographer when I have a fixed lens instead of a zoom lens, because I move around more and I think about where my placement is more than I did before. Before, if I was in a comfortable spot, I would just zoom in. Oh, yeah, I need to get closer. Now I'm moving around, and a byproduct of me moving around all the time at a wedding is people comment on how good of a job I'm doing. They don't even know what the photographs look like. I could literally forget my memory card and be like, oh, you're doing a great job today, man. I see you all over the place. people have a more positive feedback when they see me working. And it's a workout to move around a little bit more, because now if I need to get closer, I got to get up, move closer. If I want to get a wider angle shot, I have to swap to a wider angle lens or a camera. I have 2 cameras, or I have to swap lenses out. So there's advantages and disadvantages. But with anything else, the more you do it, the more you understand, the more you know where you need to be, because you shoot this shot all the time. There's times that it catches me where I'm not shooting with a wide enough lens, and I'm like, but I always shoot with Muttley. He's always my second photographer. He's phenomenal. And if I don't catch something, he always catches it. And if he doesn't catch something, I catch it. So we just kind of a little redundancy for one another. It just depends on your shooting preference. How do you zoom in and out so on the Sony cameras, there's an actual button on the back of the camera. You may not be able to see it. Come on, sweetheart. Oh, it's already on. Sorry. So you can't see the back of the screen because it's showing the back of the screen on this system I'm using. But on the back of my camera, I can click on the preview button, and then when I have the preview button set up, this one has a button. You can click on this. Now the Sony cameras have a lot of customization. You can actually change what buttons you want. There's more buttons on the back of my professional camera, so I have more customization. You can see, this here. On the Sony, I can change the function button to do different things. I can make, instead of clicking up on the roller dial or this way or that way, I can change it to be whatever I want them to do. On my camera, I have mine all set up to do certain things. And there's a custom button up here. You can set the custom button to, maybe do the, I think this right now, it actually changes the focus type. So that's what I do. And then on my Sony camera, if you look at the back of my camera, there's also the ability, when I'm shooting manual focusing, I can push that same button. Right now it does AEL focus, so it basically locks the exposure. If I'm shooting in any kind of aperture priority mode or in manual mode right now, if I set exposure lock, if I adjust anything, it's gonna compensate. If I adjust shutter or aperture, it's gonna adjust ISO. If I'm in aperture priority mode and I say, oh, this exposure is perfect, based off this aperture, it's going to adjust. If I adjust my aperture, it's going to keep the exposure the same. If you ever looked at, taking a picture, looking out your window, and it's backlit, so it's super bright outside, and your camera goes, oh, it's super bright out there, so it dims. It makes everything dark, and so the only thing you can see is the exposure outside, which is not what you're focused on. You're focused on the person on the couch in front of you, and so they're dark. You could point your camera at your lens or at your subject inside, and then you could say, okay, camera brightens up the image right now. The outside is like overexposed, but you don't care about that. You want the person on the couch exposed. You can hit exposure lock, and it'll lock the settings in the camera for that exposure. So if you adjust or you shift them to this side of the lens and to focus on them and then recompose a shot, it won't change the exposure on you. It won't like all of a sudden flare out again or dim now because you're looking at the window. But that's what I use on that button. That button on my camera, I just push this, and every camera is different. I think most cameras have like a zoom button. I think you push this button, and then once you roller dial after that, it'll zoom in and out. Right now, I think it's doing some weird stuff. So that is ISO. Does that answer ISO? I forget what ISO stands for. It's like International Standard. I don't remember I don't even remember honestly. But basically, it's this amplification of the digital image. Your sensors, it's amplifying the sensor's sensitivity to light, essentially. So, and when you do that, it gets degraded. Like I said, it works in thirds, and I kind of try to tell people to think about it as it's like taking a copy of a copy. As you amplify it, you go from ISO 100 to 200, it's going to be a little crappier. If you go from 200 to 400, it's going to be a little bit crappier. As you go higher up in ISO, it's going to amplify the sensor's sensitivity to light. It's just not going to, the image is going to get less and less quality the higher you go, especially in lower light. Huh? Yeah, you want to take a picture?
Sure, because I was going to go do something.
You were going to go do something else?
Yeah.
We'll do focus now. Yeah, every single camera has an exposure lock on it. Any interchangeable lens is going to have it. I think a lot of the point and shoots are going to have it as well. So that's aperture, that's shutter. Those are the two things. With your cameras, if you put your camera in manual mode, that's the easiest way to learn how your camera's working as far as aperture and shutter goes. If you understand that aperture is going to change the depth of focus and shutter is going to freeze things in time, the faster the aperture is, or the faster the shutter speed, the more frozen, faster movement's going to be. If a jet's flying through the air, that's a fast moving object, or a ceiling fan spinning, then it's going to freeze those ceiling fan blades, the higher shutter speed. So 1/8,000th of a second, take a photograph of a full spinning fan blade or wheels on a car turning down the road, it's going to freeze the action. It's going to look like they were standing still. And then the slower the shutter speed, the more blur, because it's capturing over time. So those are the two main functions of a camera: aperture and shutter. ISO is just kind of like a tertiary, help me brighten the image a little bit more because I'm not getting enough exposure from opening my aperture all the way and having a slower shutter speed. Maybe I can't go any slower. Maybe I'm indoors at a basketball game. The light indoors may seem great until you pull your camera out. You're like, man, it's dark in here. Even if you have your shutter speed, your aperture wide open, maybe your shutter speed at 1/1000th of a second or 500th of a second is still too fast to capture motion frozen. Maybe there's still blur. Or gymnastics at the gymnasium when kids are doing, when Adeline was doing gymnastics, I had to shoot a faster shutter because she'd be doing all this motion and stuff, and even at 500th of a second, sometimes it was still capturing lots of motion. So I had to go, 1/1000th of a second to capture her motion, but then now the image is dark, so now I got to bump up the ISO. So those are how those two things work together. It's just a combination of them together is exposure. If you have a setting, an aperture, and a shutter speed, and it's too bright, then you need to adjust one or the other. Don't adjust both, because a lot of time people will have, the image is too dark, and they'll adjust their shutter and their aperture, and they'll adjust them in a way where it gives them another bright image or another dark image. Focus on one, and when you hit the limitation of your shutter speed, or a limitation of your aperture, then you can mess with ISO a little bit. So I always say it's kind of a common occurrence to put. Let me see. I think one of the camera side. It's a common occurrence to put aperture last. Let's see. Yeah, this one's dead. Just gonna swap out batteries right quick. It's been going for about an hour or so. It's not bad. But yeah, if you can figure out those two things, everything else will come into play. And all the other buttons on the back of a camera are really just feature sets. That's really all they are, is just feature sets. Making it easier to adjust certain things or not. I need a drink. So we talked about aperture, we talked about shutter speed. The things that we also could talk about real quick is the lenses. God, I love this little system here. So let's see, this is a 135. Let's show 135, 90. All right, you're gonna do a little bit of modeling for me now, Adeline, as you're about to walk off. You're like, oh, I thought I was good for a while, Dad. So those are 5 of my main lenses. The only lenses you don't see here, or the only lens you don't see right here, is the lens that's on my camera filming me. It's my 35mm. That's my workhorse wedding lens, and then the 135 is my other. I use this because I don't have to get close to people. So I'm gonna have Adeline. I'm gonna have you stay where you're at, okay? And then I'm gonna show just kind of the difference. If I had a zoom lens, which I do on the camera that I'm filming the lenses with, it's just not a very great lens. So I'm gonna swap this lens out, and I'm gonna give you an example of each lens and what it does for the photograph. So you get the 35 or the 24mm is what this one is. Beautiful girl. All right. Girl, you pretty, just like your mama. All right, so obviously my ISO is super high, so let's bring that back down. I'm just gonna go to aperture priority mode real quick, so it'll do the thinking for me, just so I can focus on focal distances. What are you doing, sweetheart? sometimes these connectors don't quite do what I want them to do. There we go. I think 200 is the lowest on this one. No, I guess not. 125, 100. There we go. All right. So I'm at f2. I'm going to leave the camera in the same spot. I'm just going to jump to different. Let me set this up a little bit. I'm going to set this up to where it's in the same spot, and you can just see how the different focal lengths change. And this thing has an adapter on it. This adapter is not the best adapter. There you go. And that's a 24 millimeter. It's considered a wide angle lens. She's sitting about 5 feet away from it, 4 or 5 feet away from it. All I'm going to do now is I'm going to leave the camera in the same spot. I'm going to put a 55 or 28 millimeter on there. It's not much different. It's only 4 millimeters different, so you can see there's not a huge difference in distance or focal length. I'm going to go to the 55 next, quite a bit closer. Take off the lens cap, that'll help you. You can see how much closer I am to her now with just a 55 millimeter from a 28. You can see how much more out of focus the background is now. It's at 1.8. It's only like really a third of a stop, so that's where we're at with the other two lenses. Go from a 55. I love the 55 lens. It's beautiful. I'm not going to do the 90 because we already did the 90 before when I was showing you, and this 85 is pretty close to the same focal distance, but you can see, there we go, how much closer we are. Girl, you so pretty. Pretty girl. So that's the 85 millimeter at f2 as well. And then the last one I'll show you is just how gorgeous the 135 is. I use the 135 a little bit more for photographing her and showing you guys, but it's such a long focal length that you can see how much more pronounced my handshake is when I'm trying to hold it. Oh, I gotta put the adapter on there. Give me a second. Come on, Buttercup. There we go. And this lens is heavy as sin. All right. All right. And now I'm using the same distance. I haven't moved the lens at all, or the camera at all. And I think I'm in manual focus. And you can see just how much closer. But that lens is just gorgeous. It does a great job. Are you set to? There we go. And let me see what I have the focus set to. Yeah, I don't think this lens, so there's two adapters. This lens needs a different adapter for me to use autofocus. A lot of the time I don't use autofocus with this lens. I usually use it for like shots of them outside. Yeah, it won't let me focus with her. I'm gonna move it further away just so it's not staring into her nostrils. Let's see where we're at focus wise. And like you can see how just a very little movement on this lens, it makes a huge difference, and it's really hard to like keep it steady. And this is with me basing it off the table. Hey Adel, I'm gonna have you shift to the left, like shift to the armrest, all the way over, all the way over. There you go. And I'm gonna shift the lens. I'm just gonna show a little bit of how gorgeous the background is. I'm gonna hold it up, see if I can get a good shot. And if I go to, let me turn off the settings so you guys can see. I can actually do a better job holding it. There we go. There we go. All right. And so I'm just focusing right now through the lens, through the camera myself. So now you can see just how gorgeous that background is. Like the background, that swing that was back there and the shed back there, there's nothing to it anymore. Like you can't even tell it's there. It's just gone. So That's one thing. This lens is gorgeous. Hey, baby, will you come stand right there in that patch of sun? I'm going to show. Go that way a little bit more. Back a little bit more. Right there. And then this is just her up against, out in the open. Let me see. I'm going to bump. Go to 1.8. And you can see the background is like, you know there's something back there, and there's a house or a fence, but there's really nothing. All right. I had to swap out. Let me know when the sound comes back. I think I should be back by now. Come on. This thing? Y'all hear me now?
Daddy,
Yes, ma'am.
Mommy can't hear you on the phone.
I know. I just they told me the microphone died. It went for an hour and a half. That's not bad. Oh, so Dream, you're asking about this battery case. This is called a PowerPax, powerpax.net. I bought them years ago. There's a couple different ones. They had like a six battery holder for AAA's, and this one holds 12. They're awesome. I have two of them, and I put a set of regular batteries in there just for backup, and then I have a 12. Actually, I have 24 of the rechargeable loops that I use at weddings. So that's what they are. So I don't know exactly where you guys lost me audio-wise. One of the disadvantages not to having somebody here helping me with running the audio and stuff. You know, got to social distance. I was going to have Adeline come out, and I was going to talk about focus. We talked about lenses. Like I said, the lenses are just focal lengths. You can buy great lenses that zoom and cover you know, several of these lenses, like this 135, and you can get like a 70 to 200. They're usually a couple $100 for a lower quality lens for outdoor stuff. They're great. This is an 85. I would say the most important lenses when you're first starting to learn camera stuff is to buy yourself a nice 50 millimeter. Everybody calls it the Nifty 50. The 50 millimeter is a phenomenal lens because it is pretty close to what you see at the human eye, but also they're fairly inexpensive. You can get a really good 50 millimeter that does like f1.4 for a few $100. So a 50 millimeter is probably the most popular lens that you can get a wide aperture, so you can let a lot of light in. That was the first like decent quality lens I ever bought, was a 50 millimeter. So I put the 55 millimeter on here, and this is Zeiss 55-1.8. This is a great lens. It's super, super sharp. It's small, and that's the reason why I converted from the 50 millimeter that I had before to this lens. It's a lot smaller. On my camera, I can take it out with me to go shoot, you know, more personal stuff, and I don't have to have this big old, huge camera lens, and it works on my wife's camera too. So if she ever wants to play with it, she can utilize it. So the other lens that I use a shit ton as a personal lens is the f2.8 or f2 28 millimeter. I love this lens. It's like my favorite lens. It's always on my camera. It never comes off unless I'm doing a session or something like that. But as a personal lens, it's usually these two lenses. This one's close enough that I can use for portraits, and this one's wide enough that I can use for just everything else. So yeah, and you can get a 1.8 like Raymond's saying. You can get a 1.8, a 51.8 for $100, like 70 used, $100. If you want to get like a 1.4, you pay Pinnacle, you pay a premium for the Pinnacle of Aperture. It's kind of like when a 64 gig memory card came out, it was like everybody and their brother wanted a 64 gig. You can get a 64 gig memory card for like $300, or you could buy two 32s for like $50 a piece. It's like if you want all that memory in one car, you're paying a premium for it, and that's kind of the same thing. When you want a lens that does 1.4 or f1, some lenses do that 1.2. You're going to pay a lot more money for them. They're just expensive. So I would say a 1.8 is probably the best bang for your buck. All right, let me see if Adeline wants to come out here, and I'll do some focus stuff. So, so this camera has a couple different buttons on it. Obviously, it's customizable buttons. On this particular camera, it has a single roller dial here, and that's what I'm using to adjust aperture when I'm in aperture mode, shutter when I'm in shutter mode. This down here, whenever I'm in either one of those modes, does exposure compensation. Topic for another day, but basically it takes whatever your camera thinks it's got a proper exposure. It might be wrong. Every time you take a photograph, it keeps saying the photograph's brighter than you want it to be. Well, maybe you can just bump your exposure compensation down. Works in third of stop increments. Every click, click, click is a third of a stop, just like we talked about before. I'll show you real quick. All it's doing is it's adjusting its known exposure. What it thinks the exposure should be, it's adjusting that. So if it thinks that it's properly exposed and it's constantly overexposed, then you can just go and do exposure compensation, and then it'll say, okay, cool, now I know this exposure, this brightness is where you want to be. And that's really the only thing exposure compensation does. It just, bless you, baby, it lets you adjust what the camera believes to be a proper exposure up or down by a third of a stop increment. I would always say start with 0 exposure compensation, and then if you're constantly taking photographs into a window or the light's coming in, it's backlit, then maybe then you can say, hey, you keep underexposing everything. Stop underexposing everything. Go up a stop. Every time, whatever you think the exposure is, make it a stop brighter. Whatever you think the exposure is, make it a stop darker. That's really what exposure compensation is. So, so that is really the nuts and bolts of the camera's basics. Like I said, all these other buttons, this is a playback button. This function button is probably going to give me some options for adjusting some of the buttons that are on here. There may be an option for it on the screen itself. So you can like see on the screen itself. You might be able to see a little bit. Let's see. Yeah. So function button, it's letting me adjust exposure, or let me expose the different types of focus modes, things like that. I can set flash. I can set the focus mode, focus area. If I want to do continuous focus or continuous shutter. So every time you push the button and it clicks, it takes a picture. If you hold the button down after you click the button one time and you hold it down, it's not going to take another picture if it's in the single shot mode. That's what the little bracket, little square means. If I change it to continuous, it's going to take a photo after photo after photo after photo. And it's going to, right now it's slow, so it's going to do it like click, click, click. And then if you were photographing like action shots or something like that, you might want to go to high, and now it's going to like take multiple shots really, really fast in this quick succession after another. That's some of the functions. Like I said, pull out your instruction manual and you can start getting into this stuff. Everything on here, as far as like, this is a timer, it's a 10-second timer. You can do like bracketing where it takes multiple shots one after another and adjust exposures. All that stuff is really not that important until you get familiar with your camera. I always say start off with auto white balance at first, because it's going to do a pretty good job of adjusting the white balance. If you ever get a photograph that's too blue looking or too orange looking, depending on what lighting you're in, then that's what white balance is. That's a little bit more in detail, but most often the camera's auto white balances are pretty accurate for JPEG, unless you're in a really, really orange, like tungsten room or something like that. Every camera has different functions, so those are the big things on this camera. There's a lot of stuff on the back of the screen, as you can probably see. If I get the glare off of there, there's a lot of stuff on the back of the screen, and all that stuff means something. And the more you get familiar with the different tools your camera has, the more all that makes sense. I'm looking at the back of that screen. I know I'm in aperture priority mode. I'm in high burst rate. I'm in a single shot, center focused. I got recognizable faces, registered recognizable faces on them for this particular camera. That's motion tracking in the center, bottom left. I know my shutter speed, my aperture, my exposure compensation we talked about. If I roll that dial 1, 2, 3 clicks, it'll see +1. Yep, now I'm 1 stop brighter than what the camera thinks it should be. So every photograph is going to be a little bit brighter than it was before. I just leave it at 0. I'm at ISO 100. Where'd you go? There he goes. I'm at ISO 100. And there's different other JPEG modes in the back there on the bottom right. Some standard file stuff. Auto white balance. That's the metering on the top right. Is this how it's getting exposure? It's looking at the entire scene. So that's all these things make have a point. I got 22% on the battery life. I'm shooting RAW and JPEG. That's usually my thing. And how many shots I have on this on the memory card. I think it's how many shots I have, not how many shots I have left. Probably how many I have left, because my wife is taking a crap ton on this camera. So they all have a purpose, but you know, I spouted them all off. I'm used to seeing them. I look at a camera all the time. It's like my second home is behind the camera. So the more you utilize them, the more comfortable you get. We've talked about everything. That are the most important things are the different types of lenses, what the different lenses mean. We talked about how there's fixed focal lengths. We have these lenses. Some lenses zoom. A cheaper lens, a less expensive lens will zoom, but it will adjust your maximum aperture depending on how long the focus is. A more expensive or higher quality lens will let you zoom that lens, but you'll still have the maximum aperture that lens allows you to do, no matter how zoomed in or zoomed out you are. And you can see that when you look at the back of the lens, or when you read it, says, you know, the f-stop, 3.5 to 5.6. That's the range. If it's a fixed focal length, you won't have a zoom range. So the numbers on the left on this lens in my left hand, it's 3.5 to 5.6. That's the maximum aperture is 3.5, and the right hand side of the slash is 16 to 50. That's the focal length. It can zoom as wide as 16 millimeter and is into 50 millimeter. So you have limitations based off of what that lens can do. This is not a very expensive, a very cheap lens, whereas this one's a little bit more expensive. Aperture goes up to f2, and it's fixed focal length of 28 millimeter. If it was a zoom lens, it would say a dash through whatever other 100 millimeter, 28-100. And every camera manufacturer, they indicate that on their lenses differently. So one manufacturer might do something different than the other manufacturer, but they all work exactly the same. They all do the same function. You know, people get brand proud on, you know, Sony or Canon or Nikon. Most photographers can pick up any camera, and the limitation won't be their ability to take photos. It'll be their understanding of how that camera is set up. Like how the hell do you adjust the aperture on this camera? I can't figure it out. Every time I grab Muttley's camera at a wedding, I'm lost. I don't know what the hell Canon does. How to push a button and roll a button to change the aperture or the shutter, and you know, I have my camera set up the way I use it, so I understand my camera. But he's got to show me a few times, like how to adjust things on his camera before I'm comfortable with it. So those are the big things. The last thing I want to talk about is focus. And the reason why I'm talking about focus is because, like we said before, a lot of people think that the focus, something being out of focus on their camera, is the focus, and a lot of time it's the shutter. So if I'm photographing a tack sharp image, but I have a too slow of a shutter speed, like 1/100th of a second or longer duration, you're going to catch motion, and that motion is going to look like it's out of focus. It's going to look blurry. And I'll give you an example. When I was in New York a few years ago, and I did some star shots, I was taking photographs of the stars on a tripod. There was no movement, and the duration was like a tenth of a second or 10 seconds long. And I was like, man, every time I took a photograph, I kept thinking my focus was off. I was focused to infinity, which means as far out as the lens will focus out to, which is space. It should have been fine, right? And I'm like, man, this thing is completely out of focus. I don't know why. It's not all the photographs, all the stars looked like they were a little bit out of focus. And the main reason they were out of focus, it was because there was motion. The stars are actually moving in 10 seconds time. I couldn't see it with the human eye, but the camera, stationary, focused in one spot, it was capturing the stars. The Earth was moving, so the stars were moving just a very, very little minor amount, and it looked on my camera like they were out of focus, and it wasn't focus. It was just motion blur. It was just like the stars were moving over 10 seconds time, just a fraction of a half of a millimeter on my camera, and it looked like they were out of focus. So so focus is definitely frustrating when you can't get it to work, but a lot of the time it's not focus. Usually it's motion blur, or, you know, duration of time. Is anybody else drinking besides me? I only had one of these. Adeline keeps asking if these food drinks in the refrigerator are all alcoholic. I'm like, yeah, they are, baby. Sorry. They look pretty though. So I was gonna put the 55mm lens on there. I'm gonna take some pictures of Adeline because she's so pretty, and I'm just gonna show you the focus distances, or not focus modes, because they're kind of important. That's the one other thing that if you don't really understand, you're gonna constantly never have your image in focus. And that's one thing that people ask a lot, is how the focus works. So I'm just going to set this up so you guys can see my screen again. So give me a second. And I'm going to use it fixed on here. And I'm using a moderately wider field of view so you can see around her. She's not that interested in what we're doing right now, is she? All right. Let's see. Give me some cord length over here. All right, and I'm gonna, so right now, on this particular camera, there are a few different focus modes. Sony, the two that I really focus on is the single shot. So if I take a picture and I hold the shutter button down, oh, I'm in that damn continuous mode. Hold on. I want to go to single. Oh, won't let me go to that. Oh, won't let me go to that. Let's see. Such a delay on here. Why did you disable? There we go. Oh, it's because it was storing. It was probably storing those images. So I'm gonna go back up to single shot just because I want to take one image. I want to show you how the focus works. So the most important thing for these images is I'm in single shot. Right now you can see the square in the center. It's green. It means that it's captured the focus and it's not going to change. If I hold the shutter button halfway down and then I change what I'm looking at, it's still going to be focused at that distance on her. It's green. It's not going to let up. If I let go of the shutter button, or halfway to press the shutter button on this particular camera, it's going to go back to focusing on whatever it's pointed at until I'm ready to take a picture. So if I point it at her again, I push the shutter button, which most cameras are kind of default set up this way, and I push the button halfway down. It's going to focus on her, and it's going to stay green, and that means the focus is locked on her. That means if she moves, sit back, Adeline. She moves and she sits back. Now she's out of focus again. If she comes back to where, because it's focused at a certain distance away from the camera. If she comes back closer to the camera again, Adeline, lean back in, she'll be back in focus again, or a little bit too far. But either way, you get my point. If I go ahead and the whole time I'm doing this, the shutter button is halfway to press. I haven't let go of the focus, so it's going to maintain the focus distance. If I let go of it, it's going to go back to doing what it wants to do. That's single shot. If I take a picture of her, it's focused, and I hold it down, it's not going to reacquire focus. It's going to keep the same focus as and I'm still now I have the button was halfway to press for the focus, and then I press it all the way to take the picture, and it's still locked in that position. I have to let go of the button completely and reacquire the focus with every single shot. And that's usually how I shoot most things, because I'm usually capturing a photograph of this person standing there, this person over there standing there, this person over there standing there. If I go back to where I was at before with where I had the bracketing underneath the A in the top left-hand side, if I go back to like continuous shot, it'll maintain that focus distance. So if somebody moves out of the focus distance in that time, it's going to keep taking pictures over and over and over again until I let go of the button, and it's going to require focus. That's mostly what I shoot focus-wise. Automatic focus, I think it'll adjust after every single shot. A single shot. May not. Dragos might have to point out that, because I don't really ever use. I think it'll reacquire if I. Yeah, there it goes. So it's trying to reacquire again after every shot. But I already have the shutter button depressed, so it's not going to do anything. So it doesn't really matter in this mode. But it should, if you have continuous focus every single time. If you hold the button down and it takes a shot, it'll try to reacquire the focus in between every single shot. And then continuous focus, it's going to always be acquiring focus no matter what you do. If you hold the button down, if I hold it down halfway or not, before it's on her, right, and it greens up, and I have the button let go of it, it's going to go away. If I hold it down halfway to take a picture, get focus, if I move it off of her, it's going to change the focus again, and it's going to require focus on the distant object, and it's going to green up again. It's not going to lock that focus distance. It's going to keep adjusting focus depending on where I point the camera. So I'm like, oh, I want to focus on her, and then I want to recompose the shot because I want maybe her on the left-hand side of the frame. It's not going to let me do that in continuous focus. So you have to do some other adjustments, and we'll get into that in a second. So that is what the differences are between continuous focus, single shot after focus, I think is what is automatic focus, and then single shot focus in reverse order. Then you got DMF, which is kind of like an automatic focus for Sony's. I don't know if Canon and Nikon use them, but basically if I hold the button down halfway and it locks focus, I can leave the button held down halfway, I can adjust, look over there, right? It's going to do the same thing as a single shot focus. The difference is I can adjust the focus, I can fine tune it with my manual focus on the lens itself. So even though she was in focus, and maybe she was a little bit out of focus, I can readjust it. One way I use this is when I'm shooting macro. Sometimes I'll use automatic focus. I'll lock on the face, and maybe it's not perfectly, or lock on the ring or something like that. Maybe it's not perfectly where I want it to be, and I'll adjust it. Just fine, micro adjust the focus, whatever. Or if they move away, or you move away, you can adjust the focus. It's not a super useful tool for me, at least for what I shoot, but that's what it does. And then you have manual focus. If I hold down the button halfway down, the shutter button, nothing's happening. Everything right now is based off of manual focus. As I adjust the actual adjustment on the lens itself, it's going to change the focus distance. As you can see, portrait, if I change portrait, as I zoom zoom in, it's going to try to focus further in the distance because it's thinking about a portrait. You want to separate your subject from the background. You're focused on the background being out of focus. And then landscape, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. Landscape is like it's like an infinity focus. It's trying to focus the entire, like, off in the distance. And mostly when you're focusing landscape photo, you're wanting to focus like the entire scene. And you're shooting in an aperture to allow you to do that. And portrait's going to be focused more closer, near the actual lens, more so than outside the lens. So those are the different focus modes. I use manual focus a lot, and I use automatic or single shot a lot. I'm going to stick with single shot just to kind of show you guys the different types of focusing. So let's say I love this picture and she's great right here, and I want to focus on her, and it greens up, and then I'm like, I can recompose the shot. It's focus locked on her right now. I can say I want her to be off in the side, and maybe the background is like a tree or something, or flowers, whatever, and I could take that picture. And now I got that picture just as I took it. You know, and the problem with that is if you focus on something, lenses aren't lenses. As I turn the lens, even if the camera is the same distance away from her, if I point the lens this direction, I'm actually focused further away from her than I was whenever. The closest distance between her and the lens is when it's pointed directly at her. If I turn this way, the focus is actually gradually focused further away from her than she is to the lens. And so there's a small chance, depending on the lens, how wide of a lens, how close the subject is, that you lose hyperfocus. It could be a little bit out of focus. More often than not, you can't really catch it. It's not a huge deal. But the more, advantageous way to adjust this would be to, on the Sony lens, you can change the different shutter mode or the focus area. So as I go over to the focus area, which is this, I can change it. Right now it's set to flexible single spot. We'll start with kind of the generic ones. Wrong way. Is like going to be like the wide, right? So this right here is trying to focus on the entire scene. It doesn't know if I want the background in focus, if I want her in focus. It doesn't know what my subject is. But if everything in the photograph is roughly the same distance away, it's going to do a pretty good job. Where it's going to have an issue is if I'm shooting really shallow focus, there might be 2 or 3 people in here, or maybe flowers in the scene, or a bunch of inanimate objects that are different distances away, and I have a really shallow depth of field. If it try to do this, it doesn't know if it bites off on the individual on the left-hand side of the image or the flower or whatever. It may be in focus, and the other area might not be in focus. But for like a generic group shot, this should work fairly well. You could just do a group shot, and then it's going to try to focus in every single area in the scene. The other thing you can do is you can adjust zones. When you're in wide, you're in wide. It's trying to take the entire frame. It's trying to focus on everything in the frame. I'm trying to get an average for the entire frame. And you do wide, you can or zone, you can do you can shift the area. You can say, hey, if she was sitting on the left-hand side of the image, I could say, hey, I want to focus on this side of the image, and not so much on the right-hand side of the image, and now I can focus on this area of the image, and now it's going to focus on her. Whereas if I wanted to go zone to the right, it's a larger area. It's going to try to focus on the background. Well, it's probably going to probably still get this because it's eating up more majority of the frame. But now it's going to try to go, come on, sweetheart. Now it's trying to capture the right-hand side of the frame, that right zone, instead of her. Same thing as before. You can shift that. Then you have center weighted focus. Same thing as before. It's going to focus on her. It's trying to capture the center of the image, whatever's in the center of the image, regardless of what's in the center. Let's see. If I go over here a little bit. It's going to focus on the center of the image more so than the subject you might be intended. I think. Oh, wrong button. I don't know exactly all the how she has this camera. I mean, I really never mess with the camera too much other than to shoot here and there, but let me see, I'll go back. So that center focus area is going to be in the center of the frame, which essentially is the same thing as flexible spot. Flexible spot small. If I click to the right, it's going to do flexible medium and then large, I believe. And every camera has fairly similar shooting modes or focus modes. It's going to be how they want to focus. Right now, I'm focused on her. The cool thing about flexible, and the reason why I use flexible more than the rest of the focus modes, is because if I wanted to really focus on her, on the Sony, I can click the center button, the dial where my thumb is. I can click the center of it, and then it'll let me change where that's positioned. And then now I can say, hey, I want to reframe her, and then I can focus on her, take the picture, or if I wanted to do the same thing, I'm going to swap batteries out. If I want to do the same thing but the other side of the frame, I just change the flexible spot to the right and do the same thing. That would probably be the more appropriate way. Let's see. And there we go. And then I could do the same thing before. Focus on her. Change it to the right-hand side of the image. You can go up and down. I can focus her like in the rule of thirds, right hand, top right rule of thirds. Same thing as before. You can change it. For the Sonys, if you want to adjust it back to the center, you just push the center button where what you use to and the up and down, left and right dials on the dial wheel on this particular camera, or you hit the delete button and it'll recenter it back to the center. So I usually use this one because most of the time I'm shooting, what I do is I'll do that focus and then I'll recompose the shot, take the picture. I'll focus and recompose most of the time because it's faster than trying to adjust the focus with every single shot. It's hard to hold this camera. You guys be able to see. I'm definitely too close to the lens right now. I typically will use flexible small just because there's a smaller area of error. If I'm shooting like people, medium maybe, but on my A7R I can actually just click the button to adjust where the focal point is, and then I roll the dial instead of moving it with clicking the roller dial. If I just roll it, rotate it, it'll change from small, medium, large. So I can quickly just go to medium or small on the back of that. But most of the time I'm usually just set to single because I'll just point at what I want to focus on, and then I'll recompose, take the picture, focus on what I want to focus on, or I'll use manual focus. It just depends on the situation, but it's just easier for me to use single because if you have a large area, if you're close to something or everything that you want to focus on, it's like, how do you pinpoint focus if your focus is like this wide, right? It's like, I'm particular, I want the eye in focus, so I'm going to focus on their eye and then recompose. The Sonys also have like a, they also have eye focus. You can, like on my camera, I can set a button to focus on eyes. So no matter where the person goes in the scene or in the photograph or the frame, it'll keep their eyes in focus, and then I can take a picture that way. And that's usually what I use for portraits. That 90mm macro is like super awesome for, it's like so sharp. Let me see if I can, it's like the sharpest lens I've ever shot with. Let's see, I got a couple questions. Yeah, use flexible. Does focus and metering play together? So focus and metering are separate. Focus and metering are separate, but you adjust them the same way as you adjust metering the same way you do focus. I can show you guys that too to give you an example. And metering doesn't matter if you're shooting in manual really, unless you have it set up to where your camera's in manual. However, you're letting your ISO automatic. So on my A7R, I'll usually sometimes be in aperture priority mode. I'll set my aperture and I'll set my ISO to automatic. So it'll adjust exposure with that instead of shutter speed. What's up, Toothless? Huh? What? Will you get me another drink?
No.
But why?
I can.
Not yet.
I
Almost. You want to be my model?
No,
You can show off your beautiful teeth.
No, I said I could get you another one.
Okay, you can do that or you can be my model. What do you want to do?
It's dinner time.
Oh, it is getting close. Yeah, we're almost done. I think we covered a lot today. I'm going to take some photos with exposure and then we're going to be done. And I'll answer some questions. I'm going to... Well, in your picture, I'm almost done.
Okay.
I'm almost done with you, and then I can answer questions for people. Okay, but I need you to smile, though, because you're prettier when you smile.
Wait, you told you to think of play with what?
All right, you ready? You're distracting my model, Cora.
Why can I play Roblox now since you'll need to take pictures? That means I get Roblox
All right.
tomorrow.
So for metering, I don't use this camera a lot. So like I said, I'll figure it out. You can figure it out with me. This one actually has a metering button. Come on. There you go, metering mode. And what Raymond's asking about is metering. So let's just say I'm shooting a photograph in a dark room and the bride is next to the window. And I want the room to be super dark and I want her silhouette in front of the window to stand. I'm trying to paint this picture for you guys. How does a camera, if I'm shooting in aperture priority mode and not manual. I'm not adjusting everything myself. I'm saying, hey, I want you to keep this aperture, and I'm going to keep this aperture, and you adjust exposure. How does it know what to expose for? How does it know what it should be utilizing to determine how bright or dark the scene is? Well, it's trying to get an 18% gray over the entire image. So it's going to probably expose for the room, and you're going to see her and the clothes on the bed and all the other nonsense. And so that's what this multi-metering mode is. It's saying, I'm going to expose for everything in the scene, and that might work for a majority of shots. But if I'm shooting somewhere where it's backlit, like the bride's in a silhouette like that, or there's some one great example is shooting a multicultural bride and groom. If a bride is dark skinned and she's wearing a bright dress, well, the camera doesn't know if I want to expose for the dress or the subject or the bride, her skin tone. I don't want her to be like super dark, where you can't see her, her facial features. I want to be able to see all that and the dress. So I might have to tell the camera where to expose for, or I'll just shoot in manual mode, which is the easiest way. But if you wanted to use metering mode, you can use that by adjusting where you want it to focus. So right now it's trying to focus on the whole scene. Adeline, for the most part, is equally lit, from all directions. There's not a bright light coming from behind her. There's a little bit of light coming from the side, but in this particular instance, this would actually work really well because the whole scene is about evenly lit. There's some hot spots on her face in the back of the chair, but for the most part, it's not a factor. If I wanted to go and shoot a silhouette shot, you can do the same thing, where it's going to look at the center. It's going to focus on what's in the center. As you see, as I adjust where I'm pointing the camera, I'm trying to hold it steady, it's going to adjust the exposure of the overall image based off of where the center of the frame is. If I point at the black bar in the center, it'll probably get brighter. See how it brightened up a little bit? As I go to the pavement, it dim back down. So it's based off trying to hold an 18% gray on the center of the frame. And as I move the camera around, it's going to adjust based off of what it's looking at. It's going to dim when it looks at the bright ground, and it's going to do the same thing whenever you're in multi as well. It's just going to be more of an emphasis of it when you're in the center point. So I'm pointing at the back of that. You see how the rest of the image got brighter because it's more focused on properly exposing the purple. If I focus on Adeline, that purple is going to get super a lot darker than it did before. And if I focus on that, it's inner. I can hold this lock. I can hold the focus lock on this, and I can still move the camera on. It's focused independently. Usually, whenever you take a picture, a lot of the time, or you go to hold the picture, whenever you hold down the autofocus, it will bind whatever the exposure was at the time. So let's just say you're doing that shooting and recomposing, where like I focus on the bride and she's like in the silhouette. She's dark. She's a shadow. Well, the camera's going to brighten up because it's trying to focus on a full scene or whatever I'm pointed at for metering. It may change when I go to recompose a shot. So you can adjust the metering mode the kind of the same way. I think there's more options on my camera than this camera, but as you can see right here, you can adjust it. I don't know how to change the spot. I don't know if you can. Hold on, pushing the wrong buttons. I don't know if you can adjust how to adjust the metering area on this camera. I don't ever use flexible. On my camera, I have the AEL button, which is the exposure lock. What I'll typically do is if I'm shooting like this right here, I say, okay, she's exposed. I'll hold down the metering button, and you see a little star on the bottom of the screen. Now it's going to hold that exposure. If no matter what I do with the camera, no matter where I point, the exposure is not going to change. It's going to stay overexposed like it is no matter where I point the camera. As soon as I let go of it, it's going to change, or I have it toggle on, toggle off. So you can set that button to where you push it and you have to hold it, or you can push it it toggles on the lock, and you have to push it again to unlock that exposure. But they work independently. A lot of the time, if you don't have the exposure lock button set, or you don't use the exposure lock button, it's gonna, wherever I'm focused at right now, when it locks the exposure, I think maybe that's what Raymond was alluding to, that question. As I move it, the exposure is gonna stay. It's gonna be bound to whatever the focus lock is. And that's why it's important to use the exposure lock button instead of expecting it, because then you can you can get the exposure where you want, and then you can move the focus where you want, and then I can focus on, hey, exposed properly, right? Now I'm gonna go focus on the background now, and then I can take a picture. And then once I get done taking that picture, it's still kind of dark. I can push the exposure AEL button again, and it'll unlock that exposure. And that exposure lock really only works when you're in some kind of mode where there's some portion of the camera setting that it's deciding on exposure. Either the aperture, the shutter, or the ISO is set. You're allowing the camera to make a decision on that. If you're not allowing the camera to make a decision on the aperture, the shutter, or the ISO, you're making all those decisions in full up manual mode, then that AEL lock won't work. It's not going to do anything, because you're not telling the camera to keep that exposure. You're telling the camera it's going to go off of whatever settings you have set in the camera. If you're in aperture priority mode and you have aperture set to f4 and you look at something and it goes dim and it gets bright, whatever, it's adjusting your shutter and your ISO, and as well, to make the photo exposed based off what it thinks. And then you would use exposure lock. And I do that sometimes. I'll be pointing at somebody and I'll recompose a little bit, just a little bit of an adjustment. The camera will get overexposed or dark. Maybe I look down or up on a bride and groom. She's dark skinned. I'm focused on her face, and now there's, I turn a certain way, and then there's more background in the overexposed background, and now it dims the photo. And now she's like really dark. Or I'm focused on the groom, for example. He's wearing a dark suit, and maybe there's a lot of suit in the frame, and he's a light skinned guy. And now all of a sudden, now the exposure is exposing for the dark suit. And so what I'll do is I'll point at their face, the exposure will go, I'll hit the exposure lock, and then I'll recompose, and it's going to stay based off his face. I'm usually always exposing for their skin tone, not so much for the suit or the dress, because it's really easy to, in post-production, these cameras, the higher-end cameras have a lot of flexibility, a lot of information in the file. I can photograph, and on the camera, the dress can be really bright, but when I go into Photoshop or Lightroom or one of the editing programs I use, I can bring down the highlights, and her dress will be, I can bring her exposure of her dress down to evenly match the exposure of her skin, and it's not a problem. So that's kind of how the focus works. So you should be able to adjust the focus points, and so a lot of time, if most camera settings are like wide, and so it's focusing on everything in the scene. And so if I have something really close and something really far away, and I'm taking a picture, and this thing's right here, it's going to want to focus on this a lot of the time. Usually it errs on whatever's closest and whatever takes up most of the scene, most of the frame. So if something's really large on my hand right here, I'm like, why isn't it focusing on my kid in the background, and it's trying to focus on something in the foreground? Well, you have to adjust where it's looking in the frame. And every camera has so many focus points on the sensor. And so some of the newer Sonys have like 400 or 600 points on the sensor. So you can actually move that focus point an infinite amount of places around, not infinite, 600 spots or 400 spots, depending on, I think my camera has like 399 or 375 or something like that. There's a lot of areas I can move the focus pretty much wherever I want it to be. Whereas if you only have 12 focus points on the back of your camera, it's going to be like here, 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 here. It's a lot less variable, variety of areas. So so I usually do center weighted focus, and I just recompose. I'll exposure lock and recompose if I'm in aperture mode where the camera's deciding on some kind of exposure for me, or I'll just do manual mode and I'll just adjust the exposure based off of that. Maybe I can increase the ISO a little bit or lower the ISO, and that's why I like on my camera in aperture mode. I'll set my aperture, which is almost always as wide as my camera will do, because I'm spending that kind of money on that lens to shoot at 1.4 90% of the time. And I want everything in the background to be out of focus most of the time. So I'll set aperture priority, and then on my camera, I'll just use the roller dial on the back. Like I showed before, I'll use the roller dial on the back, which I guess it'd be easier just to show you guys here. I'll use this for ISO. So I'll set my aperture, and if the image is too dark, I'll just bump my ISO up by rolling the ISO up. And if it's too bright, I'll just lower it by doing that. That's usually what I'll do. It's just easy. I'll set I'll set manual mode and do the same thing. I'll set aperture to what I want, shutter based off of the action, how much movement's going on in the image, and then I'll just use this to adjust too bright, too dark, too bright, too dark. And that works pretty well for me. But everybody's different. So, you know, you just got to kind of figure out what works for you. I'm just adjusting the exposure a little bit on the camera because it's getting super dark and overcast. So I think I talked about most of the stuff that I get asked about a lot. I'll let you guys ask me questions. You're more than welcome to ask something that I've already answered. Maybe you didn't catch it. Maybe you joined or left and came back. Maybe there's something that I'm forgetting to discuss. A couple of the guys in here are photographers, and they know a little bit, if not a lot of it about photography, so they might be able to prompt a question that I haven't thought of. That's really. She told me she was gonna bring me a drink, and she didn't bring me a drink. She stood me up, man. I gotta teach. I thought I taught her better than that. So, what questions do you guys have at this point? And there's a little bit of a delay, so I'm asking you guys, and you're probably not gonna. I'm not gonna see it for a few seconds. So, let me know what you think, and I'll wait here. I'm ready to go back to work. We just moved over here, and we like the house, and it's a lot to do, but a lot of props to my wife, because I can't see how she can deal with these kids every single day like she has been doing. The video looks pretty good. I was actually wondering how good it was going to look. This little... So the portrait style settings, I'm assuming, Raymond, you're curious about like what portrait style, like, I guess clarify your question. Are you wondering like what do I set my camera for when I'm doing portraits, or the portrait styles, like the portrait settings on your camera? Because I think some of the cameras have like a portrait mode. Is that what you're asking? And then I'm gonna... Oh, okay. So you're the portraits. So you're talking about portrait style mode, like inside inside the camera. So every single camera has different like color settings or styles. You can have like black and white, you know, vibrant, standard. None of that really matters if you're shooting in RAW, because when you shoot in RAW, the camera's not imposing its own creative style on the images. If you're shooting in JPEG, whatever you have that set to, that's what your JPEG is going to look like whenever you go to edit. You can't change them. You can change them, but there's not going to be as much flexibility in changing them. I don't really ever, I just have everything set to standard. I don't have any plus or minus and greens and blues and all the different color profiles. It doesn't matter because I'm always shooting RAW. And I usually shoot RAW JPEG, but most of the time RAW. If I do shoot in RAW and JPEG, the JPEG's just there for like a backup. And the RAW, I'm gonna set everything. I have like a color profile in my Lightroom and in Photoshop that'll adjust things based off of my particular style. But I don't really mess with the camera settings because I don't use the JPEGs very often for anything other than just like a backup. And they're in standards fine. I might just bump up the contrast and the color a little bit. I love keeping the flexible spot in one location and recomposing. That is much easier than moving the spot. Yeah, it is a lot easier than moving the spot. And more often than not, unless you're shooting really, really shallow focus, it's something really close, it won't matter. I might even be able to give you an example. I'm going to turn this off again because I don't need you guys to see the back of the camera so much now. I should tell my wife to have my daughter follow through with what she said she was going to do. Oh, dang it. Let me see. Display off. Yeah, it doesn't matter, Raymond. When you're in RAW, when you get in RAW and you bring the image in, what you had set, white balance doesn't matter. None of those things matter in RAW. All right, HDMI display is off. Sweet. All right, so I'm going to see if I can give you guys an example of how recomposing could adjust the focus. Let's see. I'm using my macro lens right now because it works really well at shooting super close. So let's see. I'm at 3.5. Let's bring this bad boy up. We're in aperture priority mode, yeah. All right, so if I recompose, it's hard to tell. You're not really probably going to see in this because the subject's so close. But if I was, maybe if I get really close, I'm going to do manual focus. I'm going to do manual focus just, I think it'll work. Maybe it'll work for autofocus. Let me see. It's just easier to use manual focus. So let's just say the focus for me is that center, like between the I and the Z, a little spot, this little tiny spot right there. If I recompose, I am moving close. It's hard for me because I am moving away when I turn, but it's such a small difference in change. If I say I was to lock the focus here and then be on a tripod, which is hard for me to do because I'm inherently leaning forward and moving further away from the subject, as you can see. But if I had this on a fixed plane, I didn't move the tripod, I just twisted it, recompose, that spot will go out of focus as I recompose. And it may be hard to see here because I'm moving, I'm subject to human error, but it will go out of focus. And you'll know it depending on it's all going to be dependent on how close or how far the subject is from you. So that's the one thing to keep in mind. But it doesn't usually ever matter when you're shooting subjects further away. You're not going to notice it. Sweet. What else you guys got? This worked out really well. This little Sling Studio did a good job. I'll post this on YouTube. I think you'll be able to watch it. So if you have somebody who wants to learn and didn't see this, you can share it with them. They can utilize it. Yeah, I mean, it's basic stuff. I know a lot of the basic stuff is the stuff that people always assume that other people know. And you'd be surprised, sometimes I'll go do a workshop and I'll do like advanced. I'm almost done. You harassing me now? Wait, Mom, what'd y'all make for dinner?
Nothing really.
Nothing really. Don't say that too loudly. You're on camera. People will be calling Child Protective Services. How do I adjust the what settings? Court stood me up. She said she was gonna bring me a drink and she didn't. Do what?
Are you still on camera?
You wanna be on camera? You come say hey.
They've seen me a million times.
I know. They've been looking at your beautiful face. Are you enjoying your quarantine?
Not really.
You ready to go back to school?
But yeah.
Church scenes. I try my best to not jump the ISO to high
too high and avoid noise. No. No, I mean, the problem with churches a lot of the time is you can't use flash in there. At least in my experience, they don't let you use flash. A lot of them don't want you to use flash. I can hear that, baby. So you just kind of have to shoot with a wider open aperture and a longer shutter as possible. And then that's just one of the things Hey, Adeline, Kendall says hi. It's just one of the limitations of shooting indoors at a church when the light's poor. I always let the bride and groom know that, hey, a lot of the time I can't shoot with flash inside the place. There may be a restriction on shooting with off-camera flash, and then it's just the way it is. And I was like, hey, I'm gonna do the best I can. And I mean, in those instances, it's nice to have the f1.4 instead of 1.8 and f2s. But I mean, if that's the difference in you getting a photograph or not, then your camera, more than likely, if you're shooting a professional camera, will probably have a really good ISO on it. And ISO isn't a big deal when you're shooting with higher end cameras. I have a Sony a7 III, great camera. I actually think about buying the 4. What lens would you suggest for long distance? Like a longer focal length? You can get a kit lens. I think the Sony has a kit lens, 70 to 200. That's a pretty cool lens. It's not expensive. If you can get a 70 to 200 lens, it probably cost you $200 or $300, and then it'll limit your aperture when you're zoomed in all the way. It might be like 5, 6, if not more. But if you're shooting outdoors, it won't matter. The 85 f1.8 is great. I love that lens. That's a good lens. The 90 is good. The 135, but that's a super expensive lens. The new one's like $1,500 or more, I think. But yeah, the 70-200, it's a good kit lens, just for something fairly inexpensive that you can, use outdoors. None of it will work indoors very well. It'll be too dark. I'm gonna eat some numbs here in a minute. I am in a minute. I'm just answering a couple questions. Yeah, Sigma makes great lenses. I used to have a 24-70. When I had my 24-70 and my 16 to 24, first ones I ever bought was Sigma lenses. When I first started shooting with Sony, they work great. I've considered buying a couple Sigma prime lenses in the past. Then I just held out and bought the Zeiss eventually. But they're a lot cheaper by like a third the cost, or 2/3 of the cost a lot of times, if not half. Well, I think I answered a majority of everyone's questions. I'm seeing the watching is dwindling down a little bit now, so I'm assuming most people are getting some dinner, which I'm about to do the same. So I hope you guys gathered some information from this. I'll post a link to this, and even if it doesn't work on YouTube after this, I have all the data in this program, in the system, and I can re-upload it, the whole program again, maybe shorten it down, cut out the lull points. If you guys have any feedback, feel free to leave it. I figured since we're sitting around doing nothing at our houses, I could at least do something for the studio. No, I don't. Zeiss doesn't make a 70-200, but Sony makes a 70-200. I'm going to pull up real quick and I'll look and see. It's going to be an E-mount 70-200, which on a crop lens, it's actually more like 135 to 300. They make a higher end, the higher end 70-200 f4. I think they make a 2.8 now too. It's like $2,100, super expensive, but they make a more of a kit lens ones. I have to look it up. I'll look it up, Angie, and I'll send you a link to it. Let me see if Amazon has it. Sony 70-200. Sigma makes one, but I don't think they still sell it. They make a full frame G series. That's $1,200. I'm trying to think. They have a. I think Tamron makes one too. I'll have to go look on the Sony website and see. That's usually where I go check things out. I'll look and see, and I'll see if I can find. When I shot with Sony A mount lenses back in the day, I used them a lot. I actually bought one online. It came off eBay, and what are you doing? It came off eBay, and it had like dust or lint in it, whatever. So I sent it back. But yeah, I'll look it up. I think that is a good time. We've been here for 3 hours. Man, that went by quick. I'm surprised that any of you guys listened to me talk for that long. Pretty standard for me. So thanks, guys, for watching. If you guys have any questions, feel free to message me. I'll answer the best of my ability. If there's something I didn't cover. If I have a lot more downtime at the house, I'll do another one of these. Maybe we'll do like an actual shoot or something with lights and something cool. Cool beans. Again, got asked about this Power Packs, POWERPAX.net. They said these cool battery holders. All the lenses I have are Sony lenses. A6000 is the camera. Shooting with some Sony microphones that we bought for the venue studio. The Sling Studio is what I did all the streaming with, which is pretty cool. You just swap in different cameras and jump around. I can actually put text and stuff like that. It's pretty cool. So I'm gonna go eat dinner now. I'll talk to you guys later.